call the meeting to order. Welcome to the special meeting of the Nevada Irrigation District Board of Directors, May 10th, 2022. If you'll all join me with a salute to the flag, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Madam Secretary, will you call the roll, please?
Yes, Division 1.
Yeah.
Here. Division 2.
Here.
Division 3. Here. Division 4. Here. Division 5.
Here. Thank you. Okay, just a little update. Today's meeting is a workshop meeting first, and then time certain at 4 o'clock for a plan for water. So we will, today's item is the District Finance Waterline Extension Program for the workshop. And I see we have Doug and Shannon. Welcome. Go ahead.
All right, well, thank you.
Doug, can you move your camera just a little bit?
Who?
Just a little bit. Thank you, Brent.
Okay. Is that better?
Much better.
Awesome. Okay, so we're here this afternoon to talk about the board to consider modifications to the existing program for the 4 projects that are currently on the list, and then also to discuss how we see this program moving forward in the future, and get some recommendations, feedback from the board, and then we can kind of go from there. So, as you remember, back in March 23rd, we had our initial discussion with regards to the program, and the board had some concerns with regards to how the program operates and functions, not being equitably available to all parcels. If you live close to treated water lines, you have the opportunity. If you live at the bottom of District 4, you're not going to have any option to be able to connect to a treated water line, et cetera. Also about the fact that it was, whether it was financially feasible for the district to fund a portion or all of these extensions. We can't do it for all the parcels within the district's boundaries. So was it an equitable option to use district monies to do these financing? Again, looking at the potential for greater capital needs over the needs of these water line extensions, and whether we look at using that money to improve existing facilities that are capital projects that are much more important potentially to the overall system or larger portions than individual neighborhoods. And it currently allowed for the district to pay for all the non-financing, the non-participating parcels. So we front all the money for the non-participating. And as we talked, there's been roughly 115 parcels.
Only 4.
We've only had 4 make that connection since we've had this program in place. So it's not operating as well as we would have liked in terms of existing parcels coming online and helping offset the cost that the district puts up front. And then also just regards to the revenue, on what we paid in terms of the interest rate or the multiplier that we have on there was also a concern. So taking into that account, so first I'm going to talk about the new projects. I think that'll be a pretty quick discussion, and then we can go into the 4 existing projects. So we looked at a couple different options, and really only one came to the front that seems to make sense, and that's the one we're presenting today, which is formation of a CFD or an AD. And the reason is that that gets you a funding mechanism. The participants are paying for all the costs, so the district is not on the hook financially for any of those costs, other than some potential staff time. Should a process fall out as it goes through, there'd be staff time in helping develop the cost estimates and development of the CFDs, et cetera. So how we envision this new program to work would be, you get a group of folks that come in, hey, we're interested in getting water service down our street. Excuse me. We would develop a preliminary cost estimate, do a quick engineering analysis. Yeah, it's going to be able to serve off of this pipe pressure-wise. This is roughly what it's going to cost. Do you guys want to move forward with that? And if the answer is yes, then what we would do is say the next step will be to go through the process of approving or getting the CFD AD formed. And so we would go, because that's a very specialized program, we would go out to a consultant, we'd get bids, we'd then come back to the property owners and say, it's gonna be $50,000 for development of the CFD project. Do you guys wanna still move forward with it? At that point, if the answer is yes, then they would need to deposit the costs associated with the formation of the CFD. We would then go out, hire the consultant, and go through that process of development of the CFD. During that process, we would also start to look at potential funding options. So there's a couple, right? We talked about potentially a bond that the district may be able to do, whether we look at state revolving fund, if there's some constructed variance parcels or some other options that allow us to, like Cement Hill, which allowed us to do the state revolving fund because of those parcels, or grants. Grants are a little tricky, because typically there's timeframes of when you can apply for them and when you can get them.
Cost sharing.
And the cost sharing, and so, we would try to look at all those options, all those different options. And then when we come to the board, at that point, it would be, they've gone through the vote, they've approved, or I'm assuming they would have approved the vote. If they didn't approve through the vote, then the project's dead, and that's that, right? So assuming that the CFD is approved by the voters, it would come to the board, and the board would formally, I don't know what the process is in terms of the terminology, but you would create the CFD. Now you have the funding mechanism in which to have the project repaid over a 20 or 25-year window typically.
Yeah, the CFD is a 2/3 affirmative vote, whereas the assessment district is majority.
Yeah.
And if it passes with 2/3, then all property owners
Correct.
pay,
Mhm.
okay, so it's 100% participation then.
And that's the same as with an assessment district. But I can tell you that most agencies, when they're voting in, large assessment districts, applying assessments to homes that people don't want to be politically sticky.
Yeah,
But it happens.
there's a good reality that vote would have, if there was 20 parcels, there may be 3 or 4 that don't want it. So by approving it, they're going to pay regardless if they wanted it or not.
Do they have to pay upfront cost? Do they have to pay upfront cost, or is it just run their taxes?
No, it's put on their taxes, but it depends on, the one thing that could be also rolled into the bond issuance is recovery of the initial fees for the formation documents. And so when you're talking about small number of parcel formation districts, whether it be an assessment district or a CFD, it's a higher cost on a per parcel basis because the total cost is distributed over less parcels. And so formation of a special benefit, an assessment district, or a community facilities district, they run at a minimum about $50,000, maximum around 80 to 90. An assessment district is a little bit more complex for the formation of it because of the apportionment of the assessments to pay for whatever costs were included in that district.
And each parcel could have a different cost, whereas the CFD is they're all the same.
Not necessarily, just a different, you can still, but you can have costs apportioned based off of lot size or some other measurement, like meter size in our case. With the assessment district, the formation documents have to have an engineer's report that identifies the special benefit versus that general benefit. So the special benefit is associated cost proportionally to each parcel, whereas the general benefit is to others. There's other benefits outside of those folks in the district. With a CFD, you don't have to go through that analysis, and you don't have to go through that analysis on an annual basis. So it's a little bit easier of a formation. Most agencies now prefer the CFD method just for administration. It's less burdensome.
I was just wondering if there's a minimum threshold for participation in CFD, like, what if there's only 5 or 10?
I don't think so, but.
There's not, but remember, it's that a portion.
It's really expensive.
It's this distribution of the formation costs. So typically, when somebody requests for an agency to form some type of district, whether it be a CFD or an assessment district, what normally would happen is they would pay some type of deposit because there's some initial work that has to go in. So you need, however you're going to do it. There's a lot of legal counsel involved. So it just depends on how the district wanted to handle it. In this particular situation, you could say, okay, we're gonna front the costs and roll in any startup costs into the formation of whatever district you chose in the future. You could do that to make it easier on the residents.
And it would also, pay for the annual maintenance of the CFD, right? Because there's an annual fee associated with that, and that could all be rolled into the costs that they're paying on an annual basis.
Yeah, so there's annual fees associated with, and it depends on what transpires, right? With a bond issuance, there are annual fees associated with the fiscal agent as well as the accounting. If we were to obtain some other type of loan, you can roll in an administrative fee into the formation documents. But any cost you're going to recover through an assessment district or through a CFD has to be outlined in the initial formation documents, as well as any associated escalation of costs on an annual basis. If that is not included, with Prop 218, you cannot charge it or increase the fees over time.
Right, now
That's my question.
I was gonna say, but you can add additional time in terms of how long the CFD is for. And the reason I ask you that is because Smith Hill, I think we did that.
You have to include it in the formation document.
Put it in the formation documents, but it's like once you have that number, it's a fixed number. You're gonna pay
The reason,
$2,000 or $3,000
yeah,
for
the
investment for the next 20
The
years.
reason why people add an additional term into the CFD formation documents, so for example, with Summit Hill, once they either pay off their bonds or the loan, if they added an additional term, you could contemplate another bond issuance to pay for some other type of improvements, as long as you included that additional term in the CFD. So that means, but that gets challenging because you are committing forever to kind of having this assessment for infrastructure. But the other benefit with CFDs, which doesn't completely apply to us, but that you can include some maintenance costs also for the maintenance of the infrastructure within the district, if you so choose to do so. Long-term capital replacement, and that's why you do that double term. So, for example, Summit Hill, it's probably 20, 30-year term. They pay off their debt obligation, and then you can then utilize that payment you're receiving, the assessments, to pay for whatever thing you put in the original formation documents.
So, my question revolves around the CFD and AD. It gets us out of the banking business, right?
Mm-hmm,
But we still have to administer the.
correct.
You would still be administering the program, correct?
There's a cost there,
Mhm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a cost. Are we collecting?
But you could put the 1% administration fee into the formation documents for a portion of
Yeah,
the assessment that you collect annually, you can keep to recoup your annual
Right.
administrative fees.
How burdensome is that? And I know it takes away the heartburn of the financing part. See, I'm asking too many questions at one time. Historically, why are we offering financing if these programs are available?
If you had, 500 5-parcel assessment districts, that would not be good from an administrative perspective. They do have some complexities from an accounting perspective, so you wouldn't want to have, you wouldn't even want to have 25 for an assessment district or a CFD. You can. Yeah, you always want it bigger because it's easier for them on an accounting perspective. I mean, you don't want to have so many sets, so numerous. But you're seeing now a lot of larger cities that are going through major development. They're forming one large CFD, and then they're including new projects in as zones, which somewhat makes the accounting a little bit easier. But it does get challenging to track accounting for assessment districts. But that's largely related to long-term maintenance costs. Paying debt service isn't that complicated. You're really just accounting for the revenues and then the expenditures paid, which is the debt obligation. So that's not that difficult. It's when you loop in a bunch of other items like maintenance.
So Smith Hill was a large one, right? How many parcels?
20 or something like that.
Or 41.
Reason for doing that.
It was, and it was quite a large infrastructure. Right? We had over 10 miles of pipe, et cetera. It was a large project, yeah.
That makes sense.
Do we have ongoing admin, I mean, I think this goes to the
It does,
question,
it
but I
does.
really want to understand, would NID have ongoing admin responsibilities for a CFD, like Cement Hill? Do we not?
We still do that on a yearly basis.
And do we do collections, or the collections are paid directly to the taxpayer?
Yeah, on an annual basis, our administrative activities are related to accounting for the expenditures and revenue within the district, which isn't really that complicated. And then on an annual basis, we're required to submit a resolution of intent to allow the counties to place the assessments on the tax rolls for the parcels. So really, in the grand scheme of things, isn't all that much. Where it becomes a lot, like I just said previously, is if you're using it for maintenance, then that's a lot more accounting you have to do. There's less accounting associated with a Cement Hill or a Rodeo Flats compared to all those individual loans we have.
Right.
Well, I was gonna ask you if you could compare and contrast,
Yes, that was my next
240 parcels on Cement Hill versus how many, we've only got 117 total in all the WLEs, right? So, like, what is the admin burden of one over the other?
It's probably 10 times more on the individual loans, because you have to account for each loan payment, how the amortization left on the loan. So right now, we have to account for those each individually, and we're making one large journal entry every year that we really are gonna have to get some type of loan management module at some point, which is not included in our current financial system, nor is it in the new one, so we'd have to buy something.
Done, though.
Oh, it could, I wouldn't recommend it. No. Management of those loans on an individual basis like that is a lot of work.
And the alternative is that there's basically a lien, so to speak, put on a property owner's tax record, and so it automatically is they make a payment that includes both that assessment and the rest of their property tax payment, and we have a check written to us annually, I would assume, that covers the CFD.
Yeah, we get huge payments over.
Yeah, I don't know if it's twice a year
or
Right.
I'm just trying to be very explicit about the difference of the mechanics of managing that.
Oh, sure.
Versus buying a loan system and individually accounting for,
You have to remember, you have 120 loans, right? And they have different terms, different principal, different interest rates. And so and it's, I've heard before somebody indicate, well, maybe we have a variable interest rate that's tied to something, CPI or something. That would be extremely complicated for us to do. That's a lot of nuanced work for little individuals when you have, 25,000 customers.
I think the other part is that the CFD gets 100% participation, and the
Correct.
district gets out of having to fund
Correct.
50% of a project in perpetuity, it would appear.
Right, and that's why we had that, that's why this made the most sense in terms of getting the district out of the financial obligations of a project like that.
So back to your, I think you made the point about, there's a certain threshold for, to do a CFD because of the complication of it, parcel-wise, the numbers-wise?
Not necessarily, it's not parcel-wise, and in fact, most agencies, when they form a CFD, they'd like to do it when the developer owns the one giant parcel, right, before it's even subdivided, because it's just one vote. Actually, you have to count the votes. It's, for example, you only had two people that wanted a Waterline extension program. They wanted to form a CFD. There has to be some revenue for the CFD, so that's a bond issuance, SRF loan from NID, it's something, right? Those two people would then be also bearing the whole burden of the startup formation costs and the long-term administration costs. So even if it's $50,000, the cost, it's usually cost prohibitive when you have too little parcels. But you could, I could see a 10-district CFD form, but every CFD formation, it has to come before the board, whether it's an assessment district or a CFD, like 3 or 4 times. It's a very specific process. You have to have your resolution of intent. Then you got to bring your engineer's report, and then I think I'm almost positive it's a 2-hearing action.
Is there state rules?
There's very specific rules on the formation. That's why when we do this, we typically get special counsel that specializes in it. So a lot of times you'll have CFD consultants that do just financing, you'll have bond counsel, you'll have district formation counsel, you'll have kind of a lot of different teams to get it going.
And so we assumed that the board wasn't interested in forming a CFD, but still being the bank that fronts the money up front and then knowing you're getting 100% reimbursement, it's still over a long period of time. So we assumed that wasn't something that the board was particularly interested in versus a bond or a state revolving fund or some other type of fund that we would utilize for the program. So unless the board thinks differently, that's what we wouldn't propose that we would also be an option as a financer. Okay. And then once the formation, all that happens, then, we build the project, get it all squared away, and then we start moving forward. So, the only, and I don't know, and maybe Jennifer can be more to the discussion, based on previous experience with projects, we wouldn't anticipate that there'd be a ton of 5 and 10 and 20 parcel CFDs being formed as we move forward. A lot of them will probably fall out when we get to the cost up front to pay for the formation.
I guarantee it.
But if there's something to where maybe the board is bonding for these projects, then maybe now you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 bonds on the books. Even though you do have a financing mechanism, I don't know if that impacts the ability of our rating,
You wouldn't want
et cetera.
Yeah, you don't want to bond for that small amount of projects. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. By the time you do the bond issuance, that has its own set slew of legal fees. You want to bundle them into one bond.
Yeah, well, if we were doing other projects, et cetera.
Yeah, like you'd want to bond them all together. It depends on how we form the CFD. Usually they'll look at, and what fund it's in, usually they look at the enterprise as a whole to ensure you're making your debt coverage ratio that you're required to have for a bond issuance. So it would impact our ability to bond for other capital projects.
And so really the biggest risk, out-of-pocket risk of the district is if the formation doesn't ultimately happen. We're going to have some upfront time with Shannon's time, with an engineer's time. It's going to be relatively small. That's good stewards and parting. Correct. Absolutely. It's in the same boat. Correct. Yep, absolutely. And so until that formation and we move forward, there's always that potential for, some upfront costs that get absorbed by the district. But again, that's really staff time is what you're talking about. So anyway, if this is the potential how you want to see the program moving forward, we can go back and put together some forms and some real processes, et cetera, and bring it back to the board for a future.
So we have two kind of different points of input. How does the board desire to see the overall larger program moving forward? Because that requires a policy change. And then the second is how would you like to address the 4 projects in the pipeline?
That's the next discussion.
So I don't know if you want to provide input on the first, or do you want to provide input? Okay, let's do that.
Well, let me weigh in here, and I don't know always but I did actually a fair bit of research, because I said before, that I think this is an important program, and we are the gatekeepers for the water. And if a neighborhood or whatever is out of water, and there's 4 people, or 4 parcels, or 10, or 20, they don't really have a lot of choices. And I did some work with lenders in the last few days to find out, especially citing the cases of the folks at Maranatha, what would be their options for financing it individually, for instance, like if 10 of them house, they all came together. Well, that actually isn't a real good option. First of all, banks don't really want to loan with marginal water situations, and so you have to be able to show potable water, you have to do it within a certain time frame and so on. There are possibilities for people to get home equity lines of credit, but that assumes that they have the income to make the payments, and it's a whole different realm of qualifications and credit, and it just becomes very complex for an individual to kind of take that on. So, you know, when I went back and looked at the historical documents, you know, this program was established in 2009 by the board in response to, you know, what they called the community investment program, because there was this feeling that we needed to invest in our community, and water lines and getting water out to these areas that don't have it was an important part of what we did. So I went back and I looked at the language in the community investment program. I looked at our strategic plan goals, which say, by the way, strengthen the community investment program, just in case you were wondering. I looked at the urban water management plan, and it's very clearly stated in there that we have these programs, and there's a list of projects. I'm not gonna make everybody read all this stuff, but I wanted to show you because, you know, in our urban water management plan, which we just did a year ago, you know, we've got this list of water line extensions that's this long and says, you know, in our plan, we're going to be doing these projects, and the DFWLE is one of those sources that is cited. So what I got to was that I'm not ready. I mean, I think that there may be options other than the community assessment district or community finance district. But I don't think we have had an opportunity to really explore those. And I'm wondering, and this is what I'm offering to my colleagues, is if the greater discussion about this isn't better placed in the strategic planning component of what we're going to be doing, because this program runs throughout all of our planning and strategic planning and all of our documents. We say this is something we're doing. And if we're going to not do it, that's a choice of this board. But then I think the public needs to say, what, you're not gonna do this? We don't have this open? I mean, it just sort of feels like I'm not ready to throw this out at this moment, and wondering if it wouldn't be more appropriate to look at it in relationship to, you know, all of the things we're doing, community investments, water line extensions. There's another program, it's not a community one, but when you extend a trunk line, I forget what that's called.
The trunk line.
Well, trunk line is my word.
You don't want to use it.
Well, we did
No,
temporary
we did
service.
temporary service, there's another one.
Want to say that?
No, do not say those words. But that is
Are you just talking about,
backbone extension?
you're always allowed to, as an individual, you can extend a water line on your own dollar.
No, I know,
Go
no,
through
I'm
that
talking about when the
process with
district goes out and we put in a main of some kind. But anyway, there are all these different things that we do, and why not just look at them all in total, as opposed to saying, taking this one piece and throwing it out the door, rather than really explore all of the options. And, you know, I hear Jennifer, she and I've had some robust conversations about this, and, you know, one of the concerns that she brings up and staff does is about those non-participating parcels. Well, so, you know, or the vacant parcel, well, maybe an idea would be to explore not extending, you know, not including them in the financing. You know, in other words, and they can come in later like other people do and pay the full boat, and we would just do this for those parcels that are, for improved parcels, there we go, for improved parcels, and not the vacant.
That's what happens now.
Yeah.
So the non-participating parcels, we front the money, they go to connect, they don't have the option to finance it over the long period.
Oh, okay.
They have to pay they have to
Not
write
the
the
vacant
check.
parcels. I thought we were talking about vacant parcels.
So the current vacant parcels are considered non-participating parcels, and their fair share portion of the project costs are currently covered by the district. They're not redistributed amongst the participating parcels.
Unless it's a parcel that the owner of a vacant lot wanted to be part of the project,
Yeah.
and they would.
But that's a different, they're participating.
Right.
That's not, they're not non-participating.
Why don't we have standby charges on these parcels?
do.
And we need to look at the standby charges.
We currently charge all those
Yeah.
parcels, get a standby, absolutely.
The standby program needs to be desperately looked at. I have some very serious concerns with it.
Well, and I think, you know, my sort of final plea here is, and this is just a policy and a perspective, that I think as the water agency, we kind of have a moral duty to do as much as we can for our customers to get these water lines out where we can. I get that we can't put them everywhere. I get that we are limited dramatically by geology and topography and our treatment plants, and there are limitations to our system. I get it, and so would everybody else that that say buy a piece of property out in wherever, they're not gonna be able to ever hook up. But there are some that could. And when they run out of water, I feel like it is our moral duty to help these folks out. So, you know, that's, and it's in all of our planning documents.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere, right, I don't know how we can just throw this out and without a greater discussion about other options. So, I'll be done now, thank you.
Director Johansson.
So my core belief is that we're in the water delivery business. We're here to supply water. Andrea, we're not in the financing business, or shouldn't be. So those are my two core beliefs. So the question, do they all then go back into the hopper and get evaluated with all the CIPs, projects we got going? Or what about the ones who've been waiting for quite a while? Well, that's the decision we're gonna have to make. Are they grandfathered in?
And that's what our current staff recommendation is, that they're grandfathered in.
The full,
And we continue to participate on the parcel participating level, but not financing.
you,
I'm not
Sorry.
clear what you're saying,
So-
Jennifer.
so
I'm-
we can go
If we
through
go
that
the way,
if you
the
want.
way, okay, we have represented for 5 years in some cases that we are going to do this financing thing for these parcels. Are you saying that we now are, or you're suggesting or recommending that we remove the financing option for the folks who've been in line? See, I wouldn't support that. That isn't even a good faith thing on our part.
Could I
Go ahead.
suggest that we separate the conversation, talk about the policy issue related to the program going forward, then separate the conversation with the things in the pipeline? I
Cool.
think it's,
I
gonna
agree.
become very convoluted conversation otherwise.
So let's take the first item first. Does the board desire to continue with the district-funded Waterline Extension Program as it currently is stated?
I don't think that's the,
I'm just going through because we're all over the place. I'm trying to,
I say no.
I think this came up
I say
because
no.
we all said no to that one.
okay. So does the board want to continue to move forward with a new rules and regulations as staff has recommended, that Waterline Extension programs are allowed, but they are required to finance, and we do not pay for the non-participating parcels? Or would you prefer to go with Director Heck's recommendation, which is to continue this discussion during strategic planning?
I opt for one.
I opt for one.
Well, restate one.
What was one?
The state one is that the program would be modified so that people could still come and ask to be extended. We would help them with the formation of any type of CFD if possible, or looking for other types of grants or state revolving fund loans. But that we would no longer, the district would no longer be paying for the non-participating parcels, and we would no longer be providing financing.
And how much would, number one, mitigate some of your concern about the program overall?
It addresses all of my concern with the program, because we're no longer financing and we're no longer paying for the non-participating parcels.
And the ones in the queue right now, how would they be?
So that's second. Let's move through this first, then we're gonna go back to that.
I think we need to move that to number one.
So move forward with proposed revisions that do not include district financing and do not include district paying for the non-participating parcels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
no. I knew that was gonna happen. But I think that if we do that, we need to let the community know that NID is saying, we're not extending water lines, and we're not financing it, and we're not helping you.
No.
That to me is such a mischaracterization. We are absolutely, as Rich said, we're in the water business. We are just not a bank to finance
Understood,
your personal property issue. So
Understood.
that's,
but when, yeah.
And it's not fair to all the other people in the district have to pay for the
Exactly.
100% of their alternate supply. There's out in District Division 4, there's a lot of parcels, the Wells Run Dry, and they're high and dry.
Well, that's.
Why do
that's
we
true
gotta
here,
pay
too.
100% of it? So we're spending close to $5 million so far for 100 parcels out of our
yeah.
25,000 people, so it's not
No,
fair.
I hear
It's not
the
fair to the
concern.
rest of the customers. It's not a good use of our time.
So the next step would be, we would propose revisions to the rules and regulations, and then we would bring it back again.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to throw in a little comparison. When we do a BEP or a redundant project that benefits a certain group of people, aren't we doing the same thing?
I'm against those two.
What's that? Aren't we doing the same thing? There's still a group of people that don't get benefit from that project, and we have one big one built already and another one proposed.
It depends on the reason for the BEP.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I should say redundancy, and maybe that's a broad brush for.
having an interconnected system does allow us more flexibility for taking certain water treatment plants offline, having a different source of water. Because you have to remember, once you're already providing treated water, you have an ongoing obligation forever to continue to provide treated water. You cannot just stop providing it. And so it is to our benefit from operational perspective to have different sources of supply going in, or lines going into a plant. But that's also project by project specific. So as a board, you have to weigh the total cost versus the benefit. Now, for that project that we have been hearing about a lot, the benefit raises drastically if we are able to mothball the Lake Wildwood plant and only use E. George. So it's not apples to apples.
Okay, well, there's.
And you also have to remember, those treated water folks are already paying capital replacement fees within their water rates and the fixed portion of the rate. So there is a larger obligation to people already connected to the system, unfortunately, the people who are not.
That's really a separate.
Yeah, yeah.
I have a question along those lines. Can you tell us how many of the BEPs, because they keep saying, oh, we're gonna get all these new customers because we're putting in this backbone extension, we're gonna allow all these other people, and that's always been, all these people are gonna hook up because we have a BEP going through the neighborhood. Of all the BEPs we've installed so far, how many new customers have we generated as a result of those?
I don't know that number off the top of my head.
This is
and
the
I,
official one besides.
well, yeah, I mean.
We're just not here, we're not prepared to talk about the BEPS because we're not even talking about them.
Benefit of
Yeah.
folks that are here in the building, that we should move forward with the existing project, so, because we got a time-sensitive 4 o'clock, so we wanna, but we can get that information and get that to you, absolutely.
Just like how many extra?
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, so staff will bring back proposed revisions to the rules and regulations. And so then let's get into the second half. We have the 4 projects that are currently in the pipeline. They're identified in your staff report. We have heard from members of the community that there's great concern with these particular projects going away completely. Staff's recommendation is detailed in the staff report as we continue with the projects that are in the pipeline, that they are essentially grandfathered into the overall program for the district paying for the non-participating parcels. However, we do not continue forward with the financing component, and you may want to give consideration that because of the lack of financing, if they drop below the threshold, that we could give some type of special consideration to a less percentage of participation.
Less than 50%?
It's up to the board. If you want, that's the concern I've heard from the residents, is that they feel that if we do not provide the financing, that they will not be able to meet the threshold. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I'll restate what I said before. I think that we've moved forward for 4 or 5 years for these folks, Mary Ann set up this one, with the representation and good faith representation that we were gonna finance it. And to pull that out from under them at this time feels wrong.
If it was such a good, if these projects were so good, then why weren't they constructed already? We've been dealing with these for 4 or 5 or 6 months.
Well, because we budgeted, right, so the program only had a small amount of budget each year for these projects. And so we could get 5 or 6 on a list, but we can only do 1 a year, or 1 every year and a half, depending on the timing to go through it plus construction. So
Wasn't one of the projects, I'm not sure if it was Mary Ann, that was having difficulties meeting the participation threshold?
That was the first time they came through.
First time.
So the first time they came through, it was evaluated and gone through, it closed because of lack of participation. When the program changed to lower the participation, they resubmitted their petition in 2019. In 2020, I believe, was the first time that the budget was not funded for this program. So it basically put a stall on this entire program for the last 2 years. That's why there are 4 that have backed up, and I have basically discouraged people from submitting petitions, because it knowingly would take 5 to 6 to 7 years to even become available, because I don't even start working with them until the budget's ready.
So we are taking the financing portion out of the annual budget. That's.
You're taking, so in your annual budget, you're going to need to budget for the entire project cost, because they will, with the exception, when do they pay their deposit? Prior to bidding a construction?
At the very beginning.
So it's a 10% deposit for the participating parcels.
Yeah, that's when.
So, yeah, it's a very nominal amount of money. So an $800,000 project, you've received $40,000 up front based off of the deposit paid. The district carries the remainder amount of the project. So the $760, or in this case, it'd be a $770. And you're carrying it for minimum of 20 years on the term loan, and then for half of it, and then the other half until people connect.
30 years.
30 years. No.
30 years on the term loan.
My question revolves around the financing, where the money comes from, portion, out of the CIP or out of.
There's a little bit of a disconnect with how money has actually been accounted for here. So whether it's been
No surprise there.
whether it's been property taxes or simply the revenues accounted for in the water fund, it's not accounted for in any other way or otherwise earmarked. And earmark is basically not a real notion unless you open up an account or a different fund. With the capacity fees, these projects are they ever funded out of the capacity fees in the beginning? No. And I don't think that you could, I guess, for part of it.
Only if we upsize the line.
Yeah.
Typically, we
We
just
would
share in the cost,
participate.
which they're not responsible for those costs anyway. For the upsizing.
I mean, to tell you, get my point about his point, the answer, her question was, we're budgeting. and
Yeah,
it's
it's a
not-
budget.
It's a budget issue.
Well, but also, there was a little tweak that I wanted to add, and Jen and I talked about this earlier too, was, that when, Nancy Weber, you all know, and she was one of the authors of this program, and she wrote me and said, look, the money for this was never intended to come out of ratepayer dollars. It was always identified as either, tax monies or hydro profits. And that's how it was set up. And then Jen tells me, well, because of what we know about the financial state of being, it was not really ever accounted for in that way. But the intent was to not have ratepayers pay this, it was to have it come out of this special fund. So whatever it was, $1.5 million or something that they put every year into this, and from either hydro or taxpayers, not, general fund. So
the current way the way that the accounting works, so all revenue gets booked to its appropriate account. So hydropower revenue gets booked to Fund 50, all water revenue, including property taxes, gets to Fund 10. When they go through a rate study, they were at some point transferring big chunks of hydro revenue over, but that was not reflective of their fair share cost of the overhead costs for the entire district. So we split all of that out. The property tax is still accounted for in Fund 10, which is water operations. When we move forward into a rate study, you would take into consideration when setting the rates any other revenues that are not recovered rate revenue. And so if you have less property tax or less hydropower revenue, you automatically have higher rates because there's less of an offset.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
right.
It does affect it.
Would there be, in my head, I was saying a transfer in from hydro into the community investment fund of whatever the board, if we so went down that road, if you went down that road, so that you board would say, okay, we'll put $1.5 million in this year's budget for the community investment program, of which there are multiple programs that in the strategic planning documents and so on, that they talk about that. But we could take that from hydro revenue, and it would not, in fact, have any impact to ratepayer money, is that true?
Not necessarily, because you would have less hydro revenue to transfer over in the Fund 10 to reduce the rate. But additionally, I'd be extremely uncomfortable from a financial perspective right now, encouraging you to budget hydro revenues in any specific manner until we have some of our longer-term obligations figured out, because we're in the process of acquiring South Yuba Canal, which is gonna have some extremely large, long-term capital replacement costs, and in addition to normal operation costs. We have not been doing normal capital replacement on a real quick clip, especially on water mains. We have treated water, all our treated water plants are all kind of the same age. We have some pretty obligations, as well as the FERC license. So I am a little bit, uncomfortable saying, I recommend you commit $1 million from hydro revenue.
And, when we said that right away, I thought, oh, we're already, that's one.
Slicing up the pie already.
Slicing
Yeah,
down, it's
yeah.
not growing.
I get it, but I was just like, I'm just trying to,
No, I
in
get your
theory,
point, yeah.
was it a possibility that that would be a source that would be appropriate?
Shannon, could you speak to the, kind of the status of the other 3 projects other than Maranatha? Are all of those, if we had funds today, would all of them, those people step forth, have signed contracts, et cetera?
It's really difficult to say. So all 4 projects are at the very same level, the very same part in the process where they've submitted a petition. And as I've said before, it's really easy to sign a petition saying that you want more information. That is really just putting your foot forward and saying, please let me know how much it's gonna cost, where my meter's gonna be, what are the terms of the financing. Until people really hear the down and dirty details, I have zero clue if they're committed or not committed. And that's why you would see the shape of the project change. And it may come in looking like a big project with 34 parcels.
Like Loma Rica did, it was like big.
But then when they get the real information and people actually are willing to put some money forth and sign the contract, then you might see who's really interested and who's committed, and it's gonna look a little bit different. So I could not tell you, they might all 4 fail. They might all 4 go forward. I have zero clue.
So segue on that, I would almost prefer all 4 of them coming back to us with an RFP, request for proposal. What can they do financially? And then we know our true costs.
I think that might be challenging because there are individual financing agreements with each parcel owner as opposed to a group developer doing a project. I don't know, it sounds good, I just don't know if it would actually be feasible.
I understand that, because right now we have the extreme of not financing it at all to financing almost all of it. Something that might be a little more palatable, lesser term than 30 years, something that may be more down. I'm looking for some middle ground. We're not on the hook for the full financing because right now the financial needs of the district override that.
So you have 2 issues, right? So you have a $2.7 million in projects. You have the needing to pay from the non-participating parcels, which can be 50% or more. And so consider that money non-recoverable. The likelihood of us recovering that is not high. Then your second issue is, do you want to finance or not? I don't believe we should continue to be in the financing business. However, if the board so desired, one option could be that you say, you have, 6 months to sign the paperwork for financing, or this is a one-shot deal or you're out. We're not financing, but you can still participate. I would put some type of time period, yeah.
Must be time certain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you wanted to do financing, I would definitely suggest you make it so this isn't dragging on forever.
But that would,
Because this is an unknown budgeted item that could pop up at any time.
Right.
right. And that would be in the RFP.
50% stick with it.
Yeah.
I want to give the public opportunity, and I think Mr. Freitas raised his hand. Are they all getting before we?
So just one mention, since we were talking about the projects that are in the queue, the Maranatha folks actually fronted the application money, the deposit, on their first effort when we were under 60% threshold, we all wrote checks. And thankfully.
Did we still?
Thank you for, and it was not the 10%.
I was gonna
but it
let
was
me
a good faith check for participation.
Just to clarify, it was the application fee of the $175. They did submit, and when it failed, it was returned. So it wasn't the good faith deposit that was,
It was it was a $175 application fee.
So my error, but
yeah.
the only
But
point of
you
that
did, yeah.
we actually transacted funds.
Yes.
That was the level.
Right,
part.
you were.
We got beyond, it would be a nice thing,
Yeah.
Just echoing what Director Heck said, we've got a program that's a unique program. You have a program that's a unique program. It's targeting neighborhoods in need. It's not targeting district-wide. You have a list, as you mentioned, of projects that are not district-wide. So I'm not sure where the fear of equity comes in that respect, because the district is so varied geographically. So I struggle with the notion that in and of itself could be an obstacle, because I sort of don't see that as an obstacle. You talked about not wanting to be in the banking business. I get it, totally. However, if you strip the financing piece from this for the households in need, you basically strip that opportunity to participate in this program. Pure and simple. There are a few of us that can write you a check now for our share, but that's just a few. That's not going to be, in our case, the dozen or so households that want to participate. I suspect not all will be able to do that. And as was mentioned, we're back applying for funds. Some new neighbors, they're all in their house right now. There is no equity to get a loan from. The old timers, yours truly, among others, we're all retired, so there's limitations there. And let's face it, this financing piece of this is what makes this work for these small areas. I mean, that's just the real. I'm going to skip over some of my notes. You guys all have this lovely written document I shared. Thank you for getting that to everybody. Much of it's been discussed. Just move to something about equity. So you talked about the bigger bang for your buck. So you worry about finite funds in a district this large and being able to utilize those funds where they're most needed. Understood. Right now, we're most needed. We're not large, but we have issues that others don't necessarily have. You worry about funds for deferred maintenance, expenses outside of what would this be called, development. I worked for a state agency for 30 years. You have operations side, you have maintenance costs, you have development costs. Those two never come together. Those two never merge together. We all had maintenance outstanding that we were always trying to get to and never could in the timeline that we most appreciate. So I don't see this savings as accommodating that issue. I don't think that's a fair argument. Talked about non-recoverable funds for parcels that are not connected. You have some of those are vacant parcels, some of those are actually occupied parcels that don't need water. Unfortunately, you can't cut the line here, start it over here to catch this John Smith over here when Jody doesn't need it. You can't do that, practically speaking. That's what creates that problem. But you have you only have a 13-year history in this program, and you have limited participation in the 13 years. Part of it brought about by budget issues. And it all comes together in the same theme. So I don't think that is a fair assessment for who might participate down the road, particularly as houses sell and as properties become occupied once again. And as the water table diminishes, let's face it, it's not coming back to us anytime. It's not going to regenerate anytime real soon. This is a long-term investment for you guys. And then the last thing I just want to mention, we got a little bit caught up in revenues, and I just have to point this out because there was much discussion how the investment strategy in this loan program was so slight or small as compared to your other investments. unless I'm misreading your annualized yield, your investments suck now. I mean, you have a return in 2020 annualized basis of a 1.16% return. It's not that much more than 1.16 loan base. The following year, your return was 0.44%. You need to hire a new financial advisor, if that's the case.
We did.
Okay, good for you. I mean, I'm a little bit of a finance guy, but even I can tell those numbers aren't very good, right? So I don't think the loss that you are purporting in this particular program, even with the loan, is as great a loss as you think, particularly when you add the returning water meter rates that you're going to get out of those that become connected. They're not huge, but they're going to get bigger, right? You've already forecasted rate increases. So if you use the average numbers that are bandied about by the EPA in terms of water usage and so forth, I think my estimate is probably a little light, but you're going to get about $73 back per household under the current rate system based on average water use. $73 a month, $900 a year, $10,000 for a dozen households. I mean, that's not chump change, and that's in perpetuity. So, all that being said, you have a way to work this program, even if you just do it for those of us that have been standing on the sidelines, through no fault of our own necessarily for the last several years. So you can make it right by us, and you can go forward into the future here by doing something a bit differently. But right now, if you create a mechanism where there is no funding relief provided by the NID, then the likelihood of the Maranatha project moving forward is not, for all intents and purposes. So I just asking you to do it.
Thank you, we have to move on. Would anybody else in the public would like to comment on this item today? This time. Start on your phone. Last chance, if you'd like to comment on the Waterline Finance Program, start on your phone. Seeing none, we'll move on. Any last comments? Did you want to say something more?
I think we have to revisit it, I don't think.
I agree. So I think we received enough direction on the current program. Staff will continue to work maybe in some type of grandfathering clause for the 4 projects and give you options.
I would like to talk more about the 4 projects, but we don't have time.
We're going to bring it all back just for discussion again. There's no action at the next meeting. It'll come back for discussion because we'll bring red lines back on the existing program, and then we'll bring back ideas with the 4 programs, so maybe we can move through this a little bit more efficiently. Sound like a plan? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, folks, for coming. We will take a very short break. Okay, we're back in session with our workshop. Plan for Water Workshop. Reminder to the public that I didn't make space for this earlier, that in the workshop format, you can jump in anytime, make a comment, just raise your hand.
Use the chat.
Chat with it, use the chat, that's good. So feel free to do that, this is what this is all about. So, Jennifer.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, President Bierwagen. So we are officially on the second half of stage 3. I think we all agreed that we had just a wonderful meeting last time. So this is the second half of Watershed, and we are going to have a brief presentation to kind of review what we're doing in the watershed, how we can maybe view the watershed in the future. So if you'll recall, when we first started talking about the plan for water process, we talked about what happens after the plan for water process is over. And so one of the things that we have identified but would be fleshed out after the plan for water process is kind of this larger watershed management plan. And so some of this effort is to educate the public as well as the board about the current state of our watershed, cultural resources in our watershed, which we focused on last time, which was wonderful. And then first of all, we need to keep it in the forefront of our minds, right? We do have a responsibility for our watershed, not only from a moral perspective, but also a healthy watershed means a healthy water supply. And so I think that's extremely important. So this will be the second half. I'm hoping we get to it because we have a little exciting announcement. We did go through a request for proposal process to solicit proposals for services for the modeling and more technical efforts that's planned for the water. So that will be right after this matrix check-in, so we'll get to that in a second. And then I just wanted to note that while we're kind of doing this process check-in, that we are anticipating, so after Watershed, we're gonna do risk. I have this sneaking suspicion based off of how quickly we've been going, that risk might turn into 2 meetings, which if it does, that's okay. And then after risk, we're gonna have strategic planning. So I am thinking the strategic planning is gonna kind of come in that July timeframe. And at the particular moment, we are going to be having a fairly large construction project here at the district office. So I am looking for off-site locations to be able to hold the strategic planning workshops, which I thought would also be nice so that more members of the public would feel free to attend. So everyone keep posted. We will still have the Zoom option, so you can participate remotely or you can come in person if you so desire and if you find benefit of that. So we'll give everybody plenty of time on where that new location will be. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them right now, whether it be on the matrix and where we're at, or on our proposed plans for moving out for a little while, or anything else anyone so desires. And so everybody in the public, remember, feel free to use the chat if you'd like, or go ahead and raise your hands. That works as well. So we are open to both methods. And I'm not really seeing any questions and answers. Director Peters?
I have a few questions.
Sure, let's do it.
There's a few of the comments before was requesting that we got a facilitator.
Mm-hmm.
What's the status of that? Are we still not planning on having a facilitator?
Yeah, so the board's direction, when this has been talked about a couple of times now, was that we would utilize a facilitator at any point where it seemed like it was needed to, and I haven't heard any other direction about using facilitators, so as of right now, I'm going to continue to facilitate the effort.
And that's what how I remember the discussion, we would take it as it came, as far as need to facilitate meetings.
What, Chris?
We would do what Jennifer just said. If it was, I think the 500 people right now, that was going to be contentious, then we would essentially move to a professional facilitator. But in the meantime, Jennifer's doing a great job.
Yeah. So I agree, Jennifer should be the facilitator. I think she could handle 500 people also.
Yeah, I do too.
A great part of the facilitator is planning the meetings and making sure the meetings are operating according to the schedule and keeping them on schedule. And that's more than just to come and tame the crowd. It's more of a full-time job. And that also, so that leads into my next question. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. And then the next question was, do we have any metrics? Do we know whether or not we're meeting any of our proposed engagement techniques, or how we're doing on any of our proposed engagement techniques? Are we tracking it or doing anything?
Yeah, we sure are, so we can report on that next time. That sounds like a good item. Yeah.
Yeah, like that.
All right.
Okay. Oh, and the chart has been was last updated on February 22nd, and as we know that, all the meetings are slipping. And so it would be helpful maybe if we added a column, I'm proposing this, I don't know, add a column of when we expect these different sessions to come in based on, because we know now that there was more, we're in May, but we're still in Watershed. And so is there a way we could put anticipated times in here so people could look at this and say, okay, well, I'm interested in this, and it's anticipated to be in September of 2023 before we get to that. And if it's updated on a monthly basis as things slip, it keeps a running tracking of where we're at and where we're going, so people can anticipate when we're going to be seeing what.
So those are updated on the website. We do have a live version on the website. Depending on, if you go to the Plan for Water, there is a calendar, and it tells you when the next 3 meetings, I believe, when we anticipate those to be in the month.
And what those meetings are supposed to be?
Yeah, we don't have them updated on this particular document. This doesn't give the particular month itself of the year, but on the website, there is a calendar. Tells you when we anticipate these stages to be, and it looks out about 3 months.
Yeah, so one of the things that's been great is that more meetings have been added and more stages, either at the request from the board or from the public. It hasn't just simply been slipping, it has been for a need. So I really appreciate the rest of the board's flexibility on that.
Well, and I just think that it would be helpful to, if we're gonna be, these are distributed with the agenda, and if they would, these would be updated as well.
I think it would help, particularly in the strategic planning session, if you could preview for us, maybe at the when we're talking about the risks, you could preview for us all, both the board and the public, how you anticipate that process taking place, because that's such an important part of our discussions. And a question in my mind is, what is the relative role of the board? I'm pretty clear about our role, but what's the role of the public? And the public is advisory or gives input to the board, but ultimately it should, I believe, be the board that is setting the strategy. And so I think it's important for expectations to be set clearly, and that if there's objections to those expectations, that's not done while we're trying to do planning, the strategic planning, but it's really, that conversation is outside of that, so that then when you do strategic planning and you're facilitating that dialogue, there's clarity on expectations.
Absolutely. Why don't we do that at the June meeting? Does that sound reasonable? Awesome. We definitely do that. I'll lay out a proposed strategy, which I've already been doing. We can obtain input from the public as well as the board, and then we'll all have set expectations, so it doesn't have to keep coming up.
Thank you.
All right. Anything from the public? Seeing anything, Chris? I'm not either. All righty. Well then, I think if there are no more comments from the public or we do. Mrs. Diana Suarez, please, would you like to speak or do you want to use the chat? If you want to speak, please unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can, Diana.
Thank you. I had given a public comment talking about how the president of the board, Chris Beerwagen, had referred to Bear River as a low elevation drainage ditch and advocated for Centennial Dam. And I had asked for a neutral facilitator. I believe Otis Woolen had given a comment on that, as well as a op-ed in the Union newspaper. So I'm surprised that you guys haven't heard any voices requesting a neutral facilitator. And maybe it's just the board's voices who matter. I'm not sure how this works, but there have been voices requesting a neutral facilitator. And I would think, especially during the strategic planning process, perhaps, we had a neutral facilitator at the very beginning of this process, and it brought in the public. We split into focus groups, and it was very empowering. This process seems a lot more distant, and really the only voices that we hear are the board. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Diana. Anybody else? I'm not seeing anyone else. I think then we will go into the next item, which is related to the modeling contract for the Plan for Water. So as the board is aware, this meeting is essentially just for input, and then the actual decision will be made at the board meeting because it is a legal contract that we will be signing. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who did a wonderful job on the Plan for Water request for proposal, as well as kind of coordinating the process that we went through to bring forth the contract that we all deeply support and are happy to present to you today. So Doug, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, so again, as you mentioned, we'll actually be bringing the contract for formal request for award tomorrow at the board meeting. So this is a chance for just to review and discuss the proposal we received from West Consultants Incorporated. As Jennifer mentioned, this is the technical aspect of the plan for water process, right, which is our unimpaired hydrology and our operations model update. It's our demand model, it's our supply component, and then our alternatives analysis as we move forward towards the end of the program. So, we did send out the request for RFPs in January. We sent it to the CIP list. We also sent it to to our website, as well as we had it on the local district website, got the acronym. Anyway, I think it's in the letter. So, based on that, we received one proposal. That was from West Consultants, which, with a group of consultants, put that together. So, when we received the proposal, we did go out to some of the consultants in the area and some that we've worked with before to get some feedback as to why we potentially didn't have more proposals. A lot of it had to do with either timing. They didn't think they had enough to be able to do all of the project in one versus breaking it up into pieces and actually just bidding on components of that. We had some internal discussions about whether we wanted to do that. Ultimately, we decided let's bring West in and have a discussion. So we did that, and so I have David Curtis here. Oh, sorry, David over here with West Consultants. He'll be able to help answer questions if you have any. We brought his team in. We had a discussion internally with staff. Based on that, we thought that they were able to meet the needs, and they would do a very good job for us as part of this plan for water. And so the next step that we did is that we actually sent out the proposals to Melinda Booth with Circle, Tracy Sheehan with Foothill Water Network, Barbara Bashel with the Nevada County Contract Association, and then, of course, Joe Fisher with Placer County Farm Bureau. We had them all review the proposal, and then we met with staff and those folks and had a discussion about the proposal to see if it was something that everybody was supportive of. It was, and so at that point, we then had a second interview with West Consultant Group with the entire team, so including the folks from Circle and Foothills, et cetera. So based on that, we all in agreement that we think that the proposal is fine, that they're more than adequate, and they're going to be very capable of providing the information that we need for the project as we move forward. So, to the details, the contract amount would be the $1 million over the whole time. We can talk more about that tomorrow in terms of budget stuff. But this is more of a chance to talk about the proposal itself, the RFP. So, in addition, the RFP was also reviewed by that same larger group before it was sent out. So we did have input and made changes to the RFP based on comments from Circle, Foothills, et cetera. So, with that, I think we'll just open it up for questions or discussions that the board may have regarding the proposal.
Who'd like to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
It would have been helpful if we could have seen it and had more time to review the proposal this weekend, but, so at the last Watershed meeting, when, the tribes community came in and gave theirs, they provided a spreadsheet showing how, Western science versus, tribal knowledge, or what's called traditional ecological knowledge is approached. And did this, proposal take into account? It seems like it might be helpful to have some, for the watershed component of it, and hydrology, and that, to have input from the traditional ecological knowledge, and instead of only focusing strictly on Western science. And have you had an experience working with determining hydrology and water flow through watersheds and watershed behavior from a traditional and tribal perspective?
As a company, we have worked with tribal entities in the past, but I'm not sure if I can answer that specific question as to comparing, lack of a better term, the tribal science or approach versus quote-unquote Western science. I'm not sure I can answer that directly. But to that end, I've watched and participated in the session, the last one with the tribes here, and was actually very impressed with that. And I think it would be clearly part of our scope to include the considerations of the tribal entities in the alternatives analysis, in the assumptions that are being made, in both determining supply and demand for water in the area. So, I mean, that's in my view, a very legitimate source of input for what we're doing.
I also think that you're more likely to touch on this during the watershed component that we're going to get to. It's probably a little bit more integratable, but I do agree that when we get to the strategies, that definitely can be a consideration through the evaluation. We somewhat laid out potential categories for identifying or ranking different strategies, and so that easily can be folded in at that time, and then into the larger watershed management plan. Did you have another question, Director Peters?
Let's see.
And all of these are gonna be public involvement, right? So as we go through each phase, we're gonna be having a lot of public involvement, so we're gonna talk about the different components as it goes into it. So, be an opportunity for that kind of information to come back and be part of a feedback that we do as we move forward with actually developing the final product.
And, okay, that's good, I appreciate that. And you had mentioned before, I know that we're not gonna look at any list of HDR task forces, but you've noted on many of your water board requests that we did complete the feasibility study for that Centennial project, in that it has water supply, it has hydrology, it has environmental impact, it provides the problem statement, and is that gonna be given to this consultant to help, so they don't have to reinvent that wheel?
Well, they'll have all the information. They have the TMs that were developed with HDR as part of that. In terms of a formal feasibility study being completed, I'm aware that we actually submitted that in the documents that we had that done, because it's not.
Yeah, we've covered this multiple times, and there actually isn't one of those, there is no.
It was cited as completed in 4 or 5 state water board
Okay.
status recorded reports from 2015, fourth quarter 2015, all the way through first quarter 2018. It was repeatedly said, feasibility study has been completed. And so I think there's valuable information that I think should be brought to bear in their analysis.
Yeah, but it's a project-specific, whatever information that develops, right, which is not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to keep it as less than that.
And I'd like to comment on that, because I've been implicated again today about that. That this is a district-wide, bigger picture. This is not a project-specific, even though I am supportive of that and will continue to be. That is not part of this process, and I'm convinced that this process demands a bigger look. That those particular, whatever those studies or feasibilities or for that project do not apply to this project. This plan for water does not include those, and I will be defending that position as we go forward. I think I can stay separate, keep those two things separate in my own mind, even though some people may not think so. This is the bigger picture. We're talking about the bigger picture, not a specific project.
Okay, so we'll make sure that all relevant information is given to the consultant. Were there any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to comment on the composition of the team that developed. I think that's a really positive outcome from this process, because I think what you've demonstrated by putting together the expertise of all these different very specialized organizations coming into one to partner together, I think that'll really result in a better end product. With a lot of different minds and perspectives and experiences, so I really appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that in the previous process, there were a lot of concerns about the integrity of the process that was used. And I think by bringing the stakeholders to the table, that it was really broad perspectives. Not just one narrow view. I just think it ended up, I just really supportive of that approach, and I think it reflects the goal toward transparency in this process, and the transparency that district management is trying to have with our community and the board. So I just want to acknowledge that.
You're here.
Well, I want to echo what Director Hull said and add that I reached out to several members of that task force today and yesterday to sort of say, well, what do you think? Big number, you know, do we think this is going to be okay? You know, I kind of choked when I saw the number, but this is really important. And 100%, everybody who has been at that table said, nope, this is the right thing to do. You've got the right team at the table. You have the best of the best and the experts. And, you know, my belief is this will be something that we will not only be proud of, but also, you know, a wonderful tool for us going forward. So I'm in full support of this, and thank you very much.
I appreciate that. I think we pulled together a very talented team to specifically address the key needs that you need to have looked at. It's a great start, but you can take a little more off the bid if you want.
We already whittled him down some.
And you can say, how about, you know, a % off for cash up front?
Whoa.
I'm teasing, I'm joking. I'm joking, I'm not negotiating.
Nicely done, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I just want to say, looking at the, is this called what's it called?
The end product?
So the
proposal?
proposal is from West,
That's what it's called.
yeah.
Yes.
The proposal, in my mind, was originally, Ricky and I were concerned when we came on the board, the cost. But analyzing this and looking at the being here over time now, this is an investment in the future, not just in 1 year or one project or one anything. This is a real, and so advertising it that way, looking at it that way, I'm through with worrying about the money part. I think it's a very valuable thing we're proposing, and I want to thank you for a great proposal. I was really impressed with the level of professionalism and things I had to ask questions about, right? What does this mean?
Yeah, but it's not a report you just put on the shelf.
Yeah.
We'll be using this for a long, long time.
I think that's a really key point, that this, it's a 50-year plan, but you better not wait 50 years before you look at it again. I mean, you're going to be looking at it routinely, and so this is a framework and foundation for going forward.
And it's something the district hasn't really had. So, where we're being able to document the assumptions, document, you know, kind of how decisions would be made from this. I think that your work is just absolutely essential, as has been said. Thank you.
I had one more question.
Yep.
About the climate model. Are you working, you did work with DWR to develop their climate model, is that?
Well, I was on their climate technical advisory group, and so we had some input on a number of different activities they did across the board, not specifically the set of climate models that were, I think, described and used in the past one, past analysis, but one of the things that we bring to the table is some experience looking kind of behind the curtains, because not all these models are created equal, and there's some important understandings and background that you need to have to kind of understand what the models are telling you, and not just blindly accepting them, because there are certain things, and we talked at our meeting in, 2 weeks ago now, a couple weeks ago now, about, you know, we have a variable climate out here. Things go up and down, and, you know, we almost have weather whiplash, going from floods to drought, floods to drought. But more importantly, the climate in California tends to drift in certain directions and stays there for a while. It'll stay wet for a while, and then drift into a dry period and stay there for a while. And the models don't really replicate that very well. So it's an important underlying piece of knowledge that I think is important, and it's going to be a real challenge, I think, looking forward 50 years, to be able to kind of digest and figure out how that could be impacting what your decisions are going to be in the future.
Right, and plus our location, we're kind of at a boundary level, you know, we're right at the edge where it's 50/50, you really can't predict where we're at, where the rest of the state is dry right now and our reservoirs are full, and so you can't take just accepted models statewide and say, well, this is going to apply to our.
Yeah, you're going to get some general variability, but there's some, you know, for example, I could take Sacramento, and if I look at the average annual precipitation in Sacramento, kind of pretty good idea what's happening in Northern California. Now, year to year, year over year, you'll get some variability to that, but by and large, that's a pretty strong indicator of what's happening up here. So we can, to a certain degree, rely on some of the long-term records at Sacramento, for example, to help guide and correlate that to things that are happening in throughout Northern California, and in particular, this basin. So, to segue what Laura's been saying, as a citrus farmer, I get blanked out because 40 miles to my south, I was in the wet zone. But 40 miles south of me was dry. And so it gets sad. Sacramento has always been drier.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so I go back to your point, we have a lot of mixture going on, and it's almost microclimate type of thing. We had hail in Penn Valley today.
Yep.
Up here, no.
No, we
So-
had a big hail up here.
We had it.
Oh, yeah.
Today?
Yes,
Mhm.
Yesterday.
no.
Today.
Yes, there was a car accident on Highway 49.
That's right, you mentioned.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, even in the valley, having farmed there for decades, there's cusps. And if you're on one side, if you're on the other, whole different climate.
So, but you are gonna be looking at different models and looking at assumptions behind them and trying
Yes.
to get the best fit for this
Yeah,
unique.
absolutely. I mean, one of the things we found, and that's general, whether it's day-to-day weather forecasting or long-term climate, don't pick just one model and run with it. You're gonna have to look at a range of them, and I think we're all familiar with that cone of uncertainty when you watch the Weather Channel talking about hurricanes hitting Florida. Now, there's some of that, they use an ensemble, they call it, a group of models to try to give the best understanding of what's gonna happen. Gotcha.
So moving forward, the plan is to, prior to assumptions being inputted into the model that significantly impact the model outputs. So for example, absorption rate of development, we will kind of come up with scenarios that will come to the board for feedback and to the public, likely super conservative and not very conservative. So we kind of develop those bookends. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot, especially with our small stakeholder group, is making sure that all the folks, such as they have mentioned, especially Circle has mentioned that they would like to have Chris Schutz be involved. That is more than we're more than willing to do that, and that we'll continue kind of having these small group meetings or more meetings as they're necessary to walk through any of the nuances or details of the model. And some people are more suited to reading model outputs, where some people are not. So as we've stated before, we're going to continue to meet people where they're at, and we're happy to share all of our data. There's nothing that is not going to be able to be shared. I think just that, as we move forward, I think people are going to have to be patient as we kind of start getting this snowball rolling very slowly.
So the demand model will, absorption rate of development, also regulatory demands.
Absolutely.
Factor them in.
Oh, yeah.
They seem to be the bigger.
You have climate, and there's different regulatory bookends, right? There's unimpaired flows on one end, there's FERC flows, there's VA flows, and so that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about these bookends. What is likely? What is going to generate the most demand versus the absolute least demand ever? And those are your bookends of your assumptions. And so we'll talk about all of those. And get input from the public as well as the board. I see Beth Lawson's hand raised. We are more than happy to share all of our data with her as well and let her review the modeling. So our kind of plan is we know that we're going to be kind of having these smaller groups. I kind of call them the more, us nerdier folks are going to dive a little bit deeper, and that's just fine. It'll be very fun, and I look forward to all of the input, as well as I know that David and his group are prepared for it as well.
I think it could not have been better, so I'm delighted. And
Yeah.
I think Chris Schutz is on the line. Hi, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you for agreeing to participate. I heard that you may be helping us out, and that's
Yeah, I think that everybody just wants to make sure it's a solid model across the board, because as we keep saying, it's not, the numbers are the numbers, right? The way in which you address any needs moving forward is there's a lot of different ways to do that. And so I think as long as we continue to be thoughtful and listen to the community and listen to our stakeholders, whether it be the NGOs or the tribes, I think, we're going to be able to work through this thoughtfully as long as we keep listening. So Was there any, I wanted to make sure we didn't miss the public. I know that we had our partners who participated with us on the consultant selection. I'd like to invite any of them at this time to participate if they're on the line. I'm not seeing any of them, but please raise your hand or participate in the chat. That's okay too. Okay, not seeing anybody. Anyone else from the public have any? Oh, wait, I do see somebody. I saw somebody. Oh, I think it's Barbara Bashel. Barbara, do you have anything to add? You just have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted. So good afternoon, almost evening, directors. I was really pleased to participate in this process. And I'm very impressed with the team that staff put together. I talked to Director Heck earlier this afternoon about my view of everything. Going forward, I think that you're going to have some models that will take you into the future that you can use for quite a few years. So, you know, I know it's a lot of money. We wrestled over the money, and but you're going to get a product that you don't have now. So I think it's going to be very, very useful tool. So just want to encourage you to, you know, to approve this contract, and also thank staff and you for including me in this process. Thank you.
And then I see Melinda. Thank you, Barbara. Melinda, do you have any more comments?
Sure, I'll just echo the thanks for including us. We were grateful to be at the table and get to hear from the consultants, and support the proposal as presented is what I'll say, and look forward to participating through the process. Thanks.
Thank you, Melinda, and a huge thank you to all four of them, Melinda, Tracy, Barbara, as well as Joe. You know, we did have a number of meetings that ran way over the time I originally told them. That was primarily related to the great conversations that we were having and all the input and being able to pick our brains. They also had to do some homework, so that was great. And then they asked some really good questions at the interview, so I greatly appreciate their assistance. And does anybody else from the public have anything before we kind of move on from this item? Not seeing anybody. Are you, Chris? So the plan will be that we will bring this to our normal meeting tomorrow for actual board action. And what you'll notice is that we are not requiring a budget amendment because we are kind of getting into that second half of the fiscal year. If we do require additional funding from a budget perspective, we'll come back to the board at a later date, and then we'll be funding the remaining of the contract. So just keep posted on that. And was there any more questions or any more questions for David before we moved on from this item?
Awesome.
All right, thanks, Doug. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think they were waiting for questions. Thanks to the whole West team. There was a lot of effort that put into this.
Got everybody here. Right.
All right, and with that, I think we're ready to move on to the final. We're going faster than we thought.
Yes, we are.
I'm excited for this.
Yes, we are.
We're going. I never say that.
Preparation.
I can introduce it.
Yeah, so we're going to go into the next stage, which is Plan for Water Stage 3.5, and we'll have Greg lead this part of this effort.
So, thank you, board and public. Yeah, we didn't know if we were going to get to this tonight, so this is great. We'll run through this. Appreciate this particular stage being offered up. Must have been around December time that we made this, bring this to the board. So, this is the second phase now of the Watershed overview. As we know, last month, April 19th, actually it was just 3 short weeks ago, thought we had a pretty robust and very informative presentation by the Nisenan and UAIC tribes, which was, I think, very informative to a lot of the board members, to a lot of staff, and I think to a lot of public. So again, we thank them and their time and effort in putting together an incredible presentation. Director Peters, I wanted to answer sort of your question that you just asked about their framework, that TEK to Western science to community science. It is not incorporated into this presentation at this point. That was really the first time we saw that as well, just a few weeks ago. So I think, though, we can really safely say that it is a framework. It is something that I think our staff and NID can continuously look for and look towards as a guiding principle in everything that we do throughout the watershed, right? And so I think it's something that we can come back to on any number of levels and any number of engagement opportunities and points to bring that and those elements of those three methodologies to the fore. I mean, there's currently multiple different ways that we can manage our watersheds and our forests. That clearly is an interesting and very enriching opportunity. I think that we can look towards our operations and see how we can incorporate as best we can. So more to come on that.
And on that note, I think it would be very interesting to have a forum of all the bands of the local indigenous people, because there is the Black Cod, and there's the Nevada County, there's several of them.
Yep.
But to have a forum where they all come together and see how they can provide information to us as we manage our water.
Right. We do have, as you've seen in the presentation, we do have a framework that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service. So we've been incorporating that into this presentation as well. So I'll leave all of that for our two excellent professional staff. We've got Nasa King, who's our Environmental Resources Administrator, and Cameron Townsend, who's our Environmental Resources Technician. They have done an incredible job putting this presentation together and really worked hard. So I think we have a great presentation. We can certainly ask questions along the way, I think, if that makes sense. But we do have quite a bit of information that we want to cover. And so I think with that, I'll just open it up to both Cameron and Nasa to begin the overview.
Good evening. We're delighted to be here and have the opportunity to speak today and to talk about the watershed. We've tried to pull together really an overview for you of the things that we do to manage or take care of the watersheds that our water comes from, and to give you both the overview perspective as well as specific project techniques, strategies. What does adaptive management look like for us? What does it look like to go out and try to assess and prioritize, and then put work on the ground? What's in our toolbox, as we say. So that's what our presentation is intended to do today, and as Greg has invited, please ask questions as we go, and I'm going to launch right in. I think from here is what...
Yeah, just a reminder to members of the public, please feel free to use the chat at any time you will, and I'll sneak your question in, or go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll get you incorporated in as soon as we can. And I think we're ready.
All right. And it works.
There we go.
Beautiful. So I just wanted to begin with the NID mission statement, because as we know, we're about water. And so we have a commitment to taking care of the watersheds, to be good stewards of these watersheds, and conserving the resources that are in our care. What that looks like varies, and it varies through the seasons. It varies from the top of the mountain peaks where the snow falls all the way down to the lowlands where we drop into the valley. And so we go from over 8,000 feet in elevation at the mountain peaks, where we get snow, down through canals and storage reservoirs. There's the natural river systems. Watersheds are areas of connection. And what we're managing is, how do we hold water in these areas? How does the water move through? How does the natural system change over time? There are things that we can anticipate. There's also plenty of surprises. So how do we respond? These photos here include pretty much mid and low elevation activities. You see the installation, I believe, on Auburn Ravine of a gauge that was intended to address a fish passage issue in the top photo. The bottom left photo is at Combi Reservoir during a pilot project we did in partnership with some of our local nonprofit organizations and USGS using grant funding to do sediment removal and assessment to quantify mercury content in sediments. So these are different ways that we have to look at and evaluate impacts and issues within the watershed. And on the right-hand side, it's some of the NID staff in a cold bath, trying to keep the water flowing. This was not today, but it happens every once in a while in winter. And then these other photos as well. You see the top left photo. That's a beautiful photo of Greg and I staring at trees. And so we go out, we assess forest health. We look at different ways to manage forests to promote healthy stands. The right-hand photo that's pretty washed out actually is our hydrographer. Ashley is standing in the middle Yuba River in the middle of the English Meadow project after we had a big winter storm that scoured a big hole in the river, and we were just assessing how much sediment moves around. So there's a lot of assessment that goes into the work we do to understand the resources in our care. What I want to do today is give you a common understanding of our source watersheds, the type of adaptive management that we employ, and also to give you an overview of what are our program elements that we're sustaining throughout the years and developing for future years. One of the underpinnings of our whole program is that water comes from watersheds. That, as much as we all might say that or think that now, people didn't say that very often even 10 years ago. Water came from a reservoir. Water came from a canal. We're certainly seeing now this integral, tight connection that water comes from watersheds and that we have to take care of the watersheds that provide these goods and services. They provide things that we are integrally, entirely dependent upon. So by understanding the health and function of our watersheds, what are the issues, the risks, the opportunities, we can promote healthier watersheds and also take care of our own future needs as well. Yes.
You mentioned on the overview that from source watersheds, and so, and then you mentioned that it's from our watersheds. Is there a distinguishing? Is it a difference between source watersheds and the rest of our watersheds? I mean, our whole watershed. Because the map shows a special. This is our watershed, and this is our service area, and then there's a demarcated line.
So there are source areas. The upper Middle Yuba River, for instance, is one of the areas that when the rain and snow, when precipitation falls on it, that flows into the Middle Yuba River. There's only small areas that we can work on, but that's clearly one of the source areas. So I don't know if I'm mixing up terms that causes confusion, or we have watersheds, and watersheds are nested, so you've got smaller watersheds that together comprise a larger system. But the precip that falls and runs off as surface flow, that would become part of the source areas. So I'm not sure if I'm understanding.
Source areas, and then there's a straight line, and then there's service area.
So service area is where we provide water to.
Yeah, so let me,
These are also watersheds as well. I mean,
Absolutely.
It produces water.
Director Peters, are you flipping on the following
Yeah.
map? I don't think that's up on the screen quite yet.
Okay,
Okay.
So I'll get right to that. So this is a very simple schematic that shows from mountain peaks down to lower elevation. And we use this as part of our educational outreach when we meet with students or community groups. But really what we also do is we need to work, whether or not it's district-owned property, we need to think as a watershed, we need to plan looking at watershed areas, and then we can act on district property. So that's kind of the connection that we use daily in our work, but we also build interdisciplinary teams, recognizing that we need all sorts of expertise in thinking, similar to the conversation you were just having about bringing in people that can do specific modeling, data collection and analysis. We're doing the same thing to look at forest health, aquatic ecosystems, sometimes specific species.
So Lisa, a quick question. You mentioned, our work is focused on our district, but our watershed is beyond, I mean, the watershed that we enjoy is beyond what we own. So do you also look at those partnerships in that broader sense of, so anything that's impacting our water supply and water quality, is that the breadth of what you are doing, you and Cameron?
In broad terms, I cannot say, and we're going to talk a little bit about watershed assessment, for instance, but if you look at the Yuba River watershed, it's a very large area with very mixed land ownership, much of it being federally owned land, but there's private, there's timber companies, you name it. We are not going out and assessing the Yuba River full watershed. But we need to be aware of what's going on, because if you're downstream of an area that was, say, hydraulically mined, even if it was 200 years ago, the impacts to the watershed travel downstream. So we need to be aware of it. We need to be looking at sediment delivery, for instance. Specifically, our reservoirs are within the river system. They're not off-stream reservoirs, so they capture sediment. So if all of a sudden we're seeing sedimentation, we better shift our gaze and look up. And very often, we own roughly 9% of these watersheds. And so it's a small piece of it, but there are opportunities to work across boundaries. Watersheds don't care about jurisdictional boundaries. And there are opportunities. We've got a master stewardship agreement that we've drafted with Forest Service. We have not put it on the ground yet, but we're looking for that first project to do it, where we would work across land ownership to take more of a watershed-based approach to solving some issue, whether it's forest health, wildfire risk, erosion and sedimentation.
In fact, I have a meeting scheduled, I believe it's next week, with the general managers from PCWA as well as Yuba Water Agency to talk about this exact thing, whether they're, and on a tentative level, there is great interest in partnering on a larger watershed management plan, hopefully including some firework in there, as well as climate change moving into the future. So I have meetings scheduled with PCWA and Yuba, as well as I've mentioned it to the Forest Service, and they seem to have some interest in participating. And then once we kind of figure out what everybody's appetite for level of participation, I think that we're going to go and talk to PG&E as well. So those are kind of the big landowners with some BLM land as well. So we're thinking along the same lines. We're hoping to kind of get some kind of group effort, or at least delineate the level of participation everybody's comfortable with together, to allow to be leveraged for that watershed management plan that we hope to be tiered out of the plan for water process.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Some of these larger scale cross watershed opportunities are coming through some of these larger infrastructure grants from places like the National Wildlife Foundation, et cetera. And so part of what Jennifer's talking about is going to be looking at a lot of those opportunities for funding for much larger, broad-based watershed opportunities, because we do traverse. And you're going to see in some of the more slides coming up, sort of our small ownership in this larger, broad watershed that we call the NID source watershed area, or upper division watershed, where we have some lands that we can do activities on, and we can just go and take care of them, whether they're on hydro-specific facilities or water operations. But, Nasa, if I may, I'll just kind of go in this slide that you have on the screen, and I think this is what you were referring to, Dr. Peters. This particular line right here that you see on this screen is the difference between NID's sphere of influence and what we kind of term as our large upper division watershed, which is about a 70,000 acre zone. And in just a little bit, you'll see some Google Earth images of the various areas where NID owns, and then U.S. Forest Service, BLM, private property, and how partnerships have to be created and utilized in order to ensure that we all share in some of the management endeavors on properties that are owned by different entities, private or public.
I I could just jump in there, as a pondered this whole question since being on the board, that while, and I'm glad you used the 9%, because that was a question I had today, what percentage of the watershed do we actually own and manage versus the bigger picture? And just pondering that, while we don't own much, we are the entity that everybody's gonna look to as being responsible for that, whether we are or not. And so taking the lead, I think, is really important too. And I really appreciate what you said about the partnerships, because you look at all this orange area, that's all, well, not all, but hundreds of it is private land, but it's also part of the watershed, as Rick Peters pointed out. It runs into our facilities, and getting together with all those people, specifically on forest management, thinning, and fire also, we can do it. We can important for us to be involved, and I'm glad to see us doing that.
Absolutely. Well, and the next picture is a different way of looking at this, and this is actually, these are the watersheds, and the watersheds are color-coded here. And so you've got that same, I don't know if I can use yeah, you're not, the little dot. You see the same square if I toggle back? You see the yellow blob for the sphere of influence. It's there again. But what we've done here is we've really highlighted the watersheds. This is a watershed-based map, and this is very similar to a map we saw last month when the tribes came and were presenting, because they're also thinking like watersheds, and they're looking at connections within the systems. And so this is a very similar way that they've illustrated and planned out their activities as well. So this was something that we talked about a little bit last month. But this is a watershed-based map. So you can see here, we've also put, and I can't zoom in on this, but Cameron will when we get to the slide 10 or whichever one it is. The little blue squares that if you squint and look really hard, the little blue squares are the district-owned parcels in this vast network of watersheds. So that's something to keep in mind. And so this is Watershed 101 super fast. So watershed scale assessments are really what you do to understand your watershed area. You're going to look at different indicators, whether it's an aquatic habitat indicator, you look at water quality, you look at different things that are metrics that you can try to measure. You've got, you know, quantitative and qualitative standards that you're looking at, and you're trying to understand how healthy is this system, what are the issues, what are the risks. And so this is the Forest Service-based watershed assessment that I think Greg referenced earlier, or somebody referenced initially. There are others as well to really look at how healthy is this system and what are the issues that we need to be considering, planning for, assessing, mitigating, managing. We do this on kind of a smaller scale, but we need to always be aware of what's happening further up in the watershed, because it's through this assessment that you understand and focus your work on the ground.
And Lisa, I have a quick comment I'd like to read from the public from Mr. Gary Griffith, which I think is a good segue into what you were just talking about. Just to add in here, Wolf Creek Community Alliance, which receives support from NID and collaborates with it, works to promote and restore a service area watershed, not a source watershed, but one impacted by NID in part due to the many canals and water conveyances that pass through the Wolf Creek watershed. We are confident that the plan for water will clearly include support for all its watersheds. Thank you.
And NID, we're looking at things that we measure and monitor, whether it's precipitation data, our annual snow survey, the amount of water moving through the system. So I did a kind of a quick accounting of what are we looking at to understand how much water do we have to provide, what's the current amount in storage. And that's not anything we calculate or manage and monitor, but it's something we need to be aware of when we're prioritizing our work on the ground. Water budgets and balance. This is another basic concept that when you're working within a watershed, it's understanding that there are limitations to what a watershed can provide and to what the human impacts are without it being, without it triggering consequence. And so by understanding how much water's in a system, you start to build that idea of a budget. If you have in-stream flow requirements that you need, and you understand what's in the system, you can start to look at what is the amount that you can utilize, what is the amount you need to factor in due to climate-dependent factors that include evaporation, for instance. And that's part of the thinking of, that underlies this idea of healthy forests and forests that are better managed and not just in this state where many of the forests in our areas have kind of been walked away from for now 40 years, 50 years. So you're seeing densities, you're seeing accumulation of biofuels on the ground that aren't going to give you the highest functioning, healthiest outcomes.
Nisha,
Yeah.
do you, when you factor in environmental or evapotranspiration rate, what figure do you use for mature ponderosa pine?
Well, so we're not, so I would not say that we have equations, would it be? What we do is we're working with the forester to look at stand density, understanding that the more trees you have, the more you're going to lose due to uptake and utilization.
Yep.
So I don't have that answer for you specifically, but you can look at different forest types and then the different aspects and settings and elevations to get to that.
But the overgrowth certainly has a impact.
Absolutely. Yep.
And it may be larger than we think.
It's very significant. And the more, I mean, you can look at some of the work out of UC Merced. Dr. Roger Bales is down there doing a lot of species-specific and watershed-specific studies to look at impacts and potential source water that can be gained through properly managed watersheds. You can get as much as 10% out of a watershed. And this would be a small, it's not like you'd have to work the whole Yuba system, but some of the smaller embedded watersheds within a larger basin, say, if you can get in and thin the forest to restore, say, 30-foot spacing on mid to larger sized trees, you can get as much as 10% more water that flows out of that system. So we could find that in the literature.
Dave, I had two questions on this. Recording in progress. Budget balance, if this is the time to pass that. Finish with you.
No, sure, please.
This is a very fascinating chart, and I'm really glad you included this, because it just shows two things. I'm curious about the red marks on the chart. Is that a certain number of inches that it goes red? Is that
That was basically a design. It wasn't based on any, it was just the low side is red and the high side is darker blue.
I was wondering, was that a deficit?
Yeah, that's what I wondered too.
No. Want to deliver that. My other question is, I really piqued my interest was this trend line on the bottom one. Mm-hmm. Is that indeed, are we receiving less rainfall since 1937 to present?
Based on a quick Excel chart,
We are.
Just the default trend line, yeah.
Wow, that in itself, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that, because a couple of weeks ago, I actually covered that exact same thing.
Would you mind coming to the speaker? Sure. I mean, to the podium.
And I think we're going to have David provide the presentation he provided to all of us during the proposal review, because I think you'll really enjoy it, so will the public.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a quick clarification on the lower graph, what date is that, or is that continuously?
Yeah, it's continuous since 1937.
But each data point, is that monthly or daily?
Monthly, I believe.
Monthly, okay. All right, so if you take the top chart, you can kind of see over 140 or 50 years, almost no change.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
But if you look at it with a trailing 30-year average, like when we talk about what the weather guy says on TV at night, the average high temperature today is 65 degrees. That's not, say, forever 65 degrees, that's a 30-year period. So if we just use that same lens and look at a 30-year trailing average, what you'll see is a significant variability over a time period that is roughly equivalent to the plan for water. And that's where you'll get really interested in the talk that we'll give in the future, because it has tremendous implications to raise some serious challenges that you're gonna be facing probably as our climate kind of drifts around from wet to dry. The bottom line, clearly in the last, there's two things going on. One, we're getting a warmer climate. So the April 1 snowpack is actually decreasing. Now, it doesn't mean we're losing water, it's just showing up earlier. So that typical cycle of melt that we see in any given year is occurring earlier. More of our precipitation is coming as rain, and whatever's there is solid precipitation is melting earlier. So it changes our strategies a little bit about how we have to operate reservoirs. The other key thing, and you brought up, our rainfall since 1937 or the mid-1930s has actually increased a lot since that time. So there's been a steady, over about a 70-year period until about 2007 or so, we saw a steady increase from what we would term the Dust Bowl years. And so that's peaked. And now it's on a downward trend. So I'm a little concerned about the climate drifting back into one of those dry periods, and we've had about a decade and a half to sort of begin to get the feel for that. So those are some trends that are going on and data that we've already looked at, and we can actually, when we get into the full presentation, look at some tree ring data that confirms that going back 1,000 years.
Nice.
The scary thing is that when we had that peak in 2007, that was a peak that's in the top 5 peaks of wetness, if you will, for the last 1,000 years. Wow. So that's one of the challenges you have to face going forward.
And well, my other question on that, since you brought that up, I've heard that California has been experiencing a above average cycle in the past 150 years. Is that true? And that we are approaching a drier cycle in the bigger picture, or is that just something I've read on the internet?
Well, I'm not sure about like a 150-year chunk, because that's going to depend on where, which of the last 1,000 years you look at. But certainly on some smaller scales, looking at like a trailing 30-year average or even a 50-year average, that sort of thing, for sure, we're coming out of a fairly wet period.
Right.
Yeah. If you kind of look at the top chart, you can see a little bit of that, because one thing to look at in that top chart is how big the swings are up and down year over year.
Right.
You can see around the 1930s, it kind of dampened out a little bit and kind of consistently for about 30 or 40 years fell below the average line or the trend line. And then it kind of got more variability in the last 4 or 5 decades of the century, and you can kind of see the bigger swings. That's what we're talking about here. So when you look at what we got in, I'll use Sacramento again because I know the numbers off the top of my head, about 14 and a half inches of rain on a 30-year trailing average in 1937. In 2007, that was 20, right, almost 21. So 14 and a half to 21, suddenly you're looking at 30 or 40% increase in the amount of rain over 70 years. But if you look back, you see the reverse happening over and over again. So you have this cycle going on. And within the time frame of your plan for water, the history of this area tells us that you're going to see 30 to 40 to 50% swings over decades of the amount of water coming in to the basin as your source. So, yeah. Yes. With 1932, my dad walked across the Sacramento River, didn't get muddy.
Yeah, I believe it.
And the salt water came within a mile of Sacramento's freshwater intake valves. But in 1939, we have pictures of everything flooded from I-5 to Highway 70 with all the malaria, encephalitis, and everything else. Yeah, one of the things in California, when we look at how we manage water, one of the kind of standards has been, well, what's a really bad year? And let's put 3 of them back to back to back. Yeah. Right? So that clearly puts stress on the system. But for a couple of years, or a couple of decades now, I've been saying, well, what if it's not 3 really bad years back to back to back? But what if you get 30 or 40 or 50 sort of bad? Yep. Right. It's kind of like your bank account. If you're constantly spending a little bit more than you're bringing in, eventually your bank account's going to run dry. So that's another way to look at how much water you have to deal with going forward over a 50-year time span.
Well, and what we know is from our perspective is that when you look at that trend pattern on a 1,000-year, say, interval, when you look at human impacts and changes to this landscape in the last 200, that we're not going to effectively change the climate here, but what we can look at is, say, when the tribal representatives last month were speaking, the use of fire as a single management tool within a watershed had a profound effect. So when you see 8,000 and 10,000 years of human history and the use of fire on a very regular interval across the landscape, they kept forests open. Tree density was much different than what we see today. So when you've got these, multiple years that maybe aren't critical, but they're chronically stressing a forest, and the forest density already, it's fighting against itself. Competition is stressing the trees out. We're seeing, like in the Southern Sierra, it can hit a tipping point where you can have widespread forest health issues. And then with that, enough of a warming pattern, enough of a water issue, you see a forest shift where now your conifer species can't establish. You don't see the survival of the seedlings. You don't see, so it's like these layers, multiple layers on this. So, but good.
Awesome. Thank you.
Good time to be alive.
Yeah.
Challenging times. Such good stuff. It is good. Because we've got all these smart folks. And very inspiring.
Okay, so now Cameron's going to run through a Google Earth tour because we talk about the high elevation and source watersheds or areas where we're delivering water. This is intended to give you the bird's eye view from the top down of what are we talking about.
Okay, and that's working, and everyone can hear me. Thank you. This is meant to be a pretty brief overview. We've got lots more detail.
I was going to say, move that microphone closer because folks can hear you better.
I can always speak up.
You want to move the table that way a little bit.
Transfer the table.
Table?
Yeah,
Yes.
just pull it that way.
Pull the table this
Pull
way.
it towards, there you go.
There you go.
Hey.
Hold on, you guys plug something.
I could barely hear him.
That's perfect.
All right. Anyway, this is meant to be a kind of brief overview. We've got more detail within the actual slideshow of, the things that we're doing, but I always like to start on the broad scale and narrow the focus, just so everybody is aware where we are on the planet. California to start, and Nevada County, Placer, Sierra, and Yuba County, closer than that. These are the political boundaries that we were talking about before. NASA kind of touched on. Watersheds don't adhere to these political boundaries, but NID does. Here is, in the blue, this is NID-owned lands. This is a very small portion of this greater Ebentham County, and you'll notice that most of these are centered along these major streams or water courses that we utilize to move water resources from the upstream to the downstream. And here are our favorite, the Huck 8 watersheds. Huck stands for Hydrologic Unit Code. It's like the address of a watershed. This is in green, the Yuba River watershed, and in purple, the Bear River watershed. Notice that we have properties in both, and that they do not fit these county lines. Watersheds are nested, as mentioned by NASA before. So this is a subset of the Huck 8 watersheds. These are Huck 10s, a little more specific. And I've selected these ones to show just, these are Huck 10 watersheds that NID owns property within, with the thought being that having influence over the products of the watershed, these are the Huck 10 versions that we would have influence over if we did treatments. Huck 10.
Cameron, can you just pause for a minute and say that again? Because I don't know what you said.
Huck 10 watersheds.
Well, I don't know. What's the context? Give me the importance, and so what? What do I need to know about this?
So these are a smaller subset of our greater watershed, the Huck 8, that we own property within.
Okay.
And therefore, when we do fire fuels reduction treatments, when we do selective thinning, when we do erosion control, when we do whatever various activities we are doing to manage the watershed, these are the areas that will see the benefit.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just trying to focus it all
Yeah.
as succinctly as possible.
Thank you, sorry.
No problem. Then I guess I shouldn't continue on and say that there's Huck 12 watersheds too.
Doesn't it go to 16?
They can go very, very small.
Okay.
We typically stop at about 12. You can go,
What that stood for?
hydrologic unit code. It's the address of the watershed, for instance. Let's see, this one,
Okay.
right, you see this long string of numbers?
Yeah.
The next one south would have a little bit, it would have most of the same numbers and a little bit different. Anyway, these are the Huck 12 watersheds that NID owns property within, so even narrowing the focus a little bit more.
Cameron, can I just clarify, so just to go on that, Karen, just so you know, they have a big watershed, it goes to the Yuba River, but then you have this tributary, and it has its watershed, and it has a tributary, and that goes to its watershed, so that's what he's talking about.
Oh, contributors.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I should be going a little bit slower.
I'm sorry, this is, I can't hardly see anything that's on my screen, and that screen is, there's too much light, I can't see, and it would be just great to be able to see this better. Are you able to enlarge?
Yeah, I can.
We're gonna
We're gonna
zoom,
zoom in
let's
here
start
in a second.
moving forward and you'll be able to see it.
My mouse.
Out the mouth.
Helps out.
So we'll be cooking with fire. Yes, no problem. Okay. So here are yes,
Yes, thank you.
the Huck 12 watersheds. Blue areas in here are still NID-owned property. Green shades are in the greater Yuba watershed, and these bluish shades are in the Bear.
Can you zoom in a little more, just
Yeah.
a little zoom in so she can see, like, so, a little more? That's Scotts Flat Reservoir.
Okay.
You can see the green there,
Yeah.
Director Heck, is Deer Creek.
I figured.
So just so it starts to make sense, otherwise it's a lot of nomenclature that we're throwing around.
You can really get a perspective, so
Right.
thank you.
Because we've all seen that before, you go, oh,
Mhm.
the one with all the branches, okay, Rollins, okay.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect.
Thank you.
So here is the 70,000 acre source watersheds that we were talking about earlier as well. These are a subset of the Huck 12 watersheds. This is everywhere that we collect, say, snowpack accumulation and runoff from that prior to the surface area. This is a connection of multiple watersheds. The Middle Yuba and South Yuba, Canyon Creek, all of these are connected via interbasin transfer and shared the water resources with the Deer Creek and the Bear here. And here is the land ownership, another one that we kind of touched on earlier.
Maybe zoom in
Yeah.
a bit
Zoom in a little.
upper, so they can see.
Mhm. So you'll see here, we have 9% of the source watersheds is NID here in blue. We've got the U.S. Forest Service makes up approximately 54% of this watershed land, and other private owners is the blank area in between, that's 37%.
Is that the brown one, is the private road?
Yeah, just blank, it's no color.
Can you read what are those percentages again, NID, what?
NID is 9%. U.S. Forest Service is 54%. And other private is about 37% within this 70,000 acre watershed boundary. And that's after we remove the area that's beneath Jackson Meadows and Bowman. I note this, kind of like what we talked about earlier, that this is a collaborative effort, and to have an actual notable effect on watershed health and function and the resources that come from it, it takes a village. So this is what Nathan and I in our work call the collection area. We have various properties throughout here with different uses. We have open watershed lands and we have campgrounds. She's going to go into a lot more detail on what exactly we do at all of these places, but hazard tree removal, there's a difference in what we perform in the collection area versus our mid-elevation and low-elevation properties. We take into a lot more consideration snowpack in this area and managing the forest for it. And in addition, we have meadows in this area, specifically montane meadows, which are a rare habitat in the Sierra Nevada. Turn that off so we can see. The one that we all know about here, English meadow.
Describe, I'm sorry, montane, how is it differentiated from any other meadow?
By location. By location, and you're going to have a different species composition and biodiversity of.
Is there a specific definition for that?
Montane meadow? I know it's a habitat type, so there is wet meadow, annual grassland, and there is montane meadow. But I think montane just means in the mountains. So, yeah, and they're kind of considered special just because they are a refugia for wildlife and other species, or species of wildlife, because often for miles and miles in any direction, it's not a whole lot. Right. So they enjoy the water and the grasses and the things that settle in these basins and valleys.
And by the way, they're beautiful places.
Yeah. So anyway, English meadow is the one that is most notable for us. We're working on a project right now to thin the forest around the meadow basin to protect the meadow habitat from incidental wildfire and to promote snowpack accumulation, carbon sequestration, et cetera, as well as performing in-stream work to reconnect the channel to the floodplain, attenuate sediment, and otherwise improve or restore the habitat that was there.
Lisa, you may have mentioned this before with that project, but you've also mentioned that you see Merced research of, kind of improving 10% water quantity through effective management of the forest or the watershed. Are we measuring water, the difference that we can expect with this treatment before and after?
We sure are. District staff, I've been working with the hydro department staff for 5 years up there, and we put an in-stream gauge. If I use a mouse, can you see?
Yeah, everyone can see
nice.
that.
And this can, if I can get there, right in this area. So, oh no, sorry. No, it's on ours.
No, it's on ours. It's just right on the edge here.
It's right here. Okay, sorry, it's right there. We have an in-stream gauge that district staff installed on the Middle Yuba River, so we have now 3 or 4 pre-project stream flow years. We've already gathered flow data. We've got temperature instrumentation on site. So yes, Director Hull, we're looking at the flows in the river. This is a very, very flashy area, which means the river can pop up very high on, say, a rain on snow event, and then it drops back down, 12 vertical feet sometimes. So 1 year gives you 1 year's information. 3 years is nice. A whole lot of years is really good to understand. So we don't have a whole lot of years, but we've collected, this might be our 4th winter actually. So we have a gauge in place, so we'll have pre-project data and then post.
I assume the blue lines are district property lines?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we just had a question from the public, which I think is a great idea, and we've talked about before. Can we lead a public tour of, while the restoration work's going on?
Yes. We're going to.
Yes, it sounds like we will.
You can, I think.
We gotta get at, right now, it's park and hike. And so to do that, of course, we'll come up with a safe time before snow arrives.
Monica needs to open up her campground.
And
Yeah, we have to wait for more favorable weather, but we'll get one put on the calendar soon.
like October. September.
Probably September.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to make sure we're not we don't want to be taking a bunch of people into the deep mountains
Yeah,
during fire season.
it's no fun being up there in fire season and seeing smoke.
Right. Okay.
It's a long way from getting out. Okay, so, tuning from the meadows, we have more. These are additional meadows to English Meadow, Austin, and Shotgun and Middle over here. Similar idea. Hopefully, we can get in and do more project activity there. So moving on from the upper division or collection area, we get into our mid-elevation storage reservoirs. Treatments in these areas typically are more focused on fire fuels reduction due to the adjacency of residential. You know, you have the city of Grass Valley here and Cascade Shores here at Scotts Flat, all of them. Here we are at Scotts Flat in the Deer Creek watershed. You see the work that we have completed so far. We've pretty much put a buffer completely around Scotts Flat. This was a majority mechanical thinning, hand crew, and chipper.
Zoom in a little bit. Just
zoom in.
Just zoom a little bit.
As well as selective thinning and harvest here to remove overstory trees as well as the understory, which we would get with mechanical thinning. This creates the Deer Creek shaded fuel break here. This is a strategic wildfire response zone. And in addition, we treated the campgrounds as they are pretty high ignition potential. Similar to Scotts Flat, we jump over into the Bear River now, Bear River Watershed, rather. And here's the work that we've completed as of today to mitigate fire fuels and improve forest health, decrease competition, etc. This is Orchard Springs Campground, Long Ravine Campground, and Peninsula Campground. Again, notice the adjacency to pretty dense residential areas. Colfax is down south of here.
Can you explain the coloring?
Yes.
These are separate projects. So the orange here is CAL FIRE, California Forest Improvement Program funding from 2020, and the red is that same program that we participated in 2018. So they're separate projects. This was completed in 2018, and this was completed in 2020.
A lot of our work gets done in partnership with some of the funding agencies. CAL FIRE, Sierra Nevada Conservancy would be the two big ones that really help with healthy forest fire fuels reduction work.
So nearby in August, here is the location where the river fire occurred. Google likes to make things nice and green and look good for you, but this is what it looks like now. The red.
Again, scroll in a little bit more.
Yes.
Thank you.
So this red boundary is just a GIS boundary of where the fire was. You can see the retardant line in this photo. Essentially, this is the 3,000 acres that the river fire burned, the entire scar. Of that, NID had about 300 acres that was affected by the fire. Here's our treatment areas. This is the John Henry Meyer Canal where we went in immediately following the fire to remove the hazard trees from our infrastructure. The green areas are also associated with the emergency mitigation actions that we did immediately post-fire. This is a mastication zone where we reduced fuel, hazard tree removal, and otherwise thinning. And this was for the Bear River Canal. We removed all of the dead vegetation to make sure we didn't have anything fall post-fire. These yellow areas are, we have a proposal accepted by the Sierra Nevada Conservancy Wildfire Forest Resilience Program. And that will expand the treatment area within the burn scar, about 150 additional acres of mastication in areas where the fire didn't burn, hazard tree removal where it did, erosion control. We're retaining snags for habitat periodically throughout this area, but for the most part, we want to get rid of most of the fuels in case another fire does come through. And That fire included part of what we consider to be our lower elevation properties. This is Combi Reservoir down here at the very bottom. That's the last of NID's storage reservoirs. We own lots of large and small parcels within this area. We do graze this area to keep the grass height managed for fire fuels. Our largest and most notable is here, Magnolia Parker Ranch. This brown reddish area is where we completed in 2020 the Magnolia fuel break. We selectively harvested buffer zone. It's intended to be a strategic wildfire response area that essentially retardant can hit the ground when they come through with the planes. We have a grant coming in later this year, if not early next year, from CAL FIRE, another California Forest Improvement Grant, to expand this shaded fuel break out another 123 acres. And that,
How many acres is that one parcel?
about,
500?
yeah.
That was strategically placed due to its proximity towards Lake of the Pines. If something came up most similar to like a river fire and went west, that was the concept for that project.
You mentioned grazing on that one. A question I had earlier, but held off. Grazing is certainly historic in the mountains. What part, either positive or negative, do you guys feel is grazing on our watershed? Because I know it's controversial, right?
Yeah, it is. We have grazing leases
Right.
on some of our larger oak woodland grassland communities, like this Magnolia Parker Ranch, which is approximately 500 acres. My approach is that it's a tool, and it needs to be well managed and monitored. So our grazing leases in these mid-elevation areas, they're low numbers of animals. Our grazing leases right now, the three I can think of that are around the Magnolia area, due to the grasses that grow there, they're all cattle. I know the district, we also bring goats on site. So we do different grazing practices depending on what the objective is. So grazing leases are parcels that we rent out or lease out to someone to put cows on during part of the year, or sometimes they're year-round, but usually it's a very low density or low number of animals allowed. Our source watersheds are within the U.S. Forest Service's grazing allotments. So the allotments are different in nature, and they contract with a grazing party, a person or people, to graze thousands of acres, and they put these circles over it, much like Cameron's white circles here, and if you're in the circle, you're in it, and if you're out, you're out, and those go back to homestead areas. So it's an interesting, that's, I think, the history.
And that is, aren't we partners with one in English Meadow?
We have two up there.
Two of them.
Yep, we've got Canyon Creek and English Meadow are part of U.S. Forest Service grazing allotments. And we've had, over time, it works for us sometimes it doesn't work.
That's what I thought, yeah.
So that would be my answer there. And there are certain things that you can really look at in terms of making sure you're managing for multiple objectives. Like if you have willow flycatcher, you need to be aware, and that's a very protected and potential species on some of the upper montane or mountainous areas. So then you need to be aware of what species you need to monitor for in terms of threatened and endangered species. It's a can of worms,
Okay.
but it's a tool.
Oh, that's what I thought. Are we more on the side of it's a benefit or on the side of it's a environmental challenge for the watershed?
It's an acceptable management practice, as long as you're monitoring and using it properly. It's used throughout areas under conservatorship all over the state. In fact, Dan Macon, who we all know, he states, he's kind of our expert, specifically with agricultural activities as well as their impacts on soil conditions. Mr. Macon states, appropriate grazing depends on the goals on a particular site, which I think is consistent with what we were saying. Sometimes a higher density grazing can be appropriate. And then he also adds, U.S. Forest Service has well-developed standards and guides directing its grazing programs, standards and guides that protect water quality, habitat values, et cetera.
And what we've seen north of here was during the fires last year, and some of the montane or the meadow environments, and I'm stuck on montanes, we talked about the meadow environments where you had very thick thatch layers, which is the dead grasses that can accumulate because we don't have large grazing herds of elk or what have you. They burned really hot. So we partner with Plumas Corporation out of Quincy, California, and they're up in meadow areas that the heat of the burn is really concerning now. They're not, so big, thick layers of dead grass aren't ideal either.
Okay, so I'm going to also do a quick time check. We're about 20 minutes till the end of our allotted time. How are we feeling? Are you guys able to go through the remainder of the presentation fairly quickly?
Yes, ma'am, let's do it.
If we don't ask questions.
Let's 20 minutes. You can do it.
We should
Okay.
do it.
Are you
Stop and
done?
share.
Let's do it.
I'm
Okay,
out.
how do I get back?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
We may have to cut the,
We talked about the
video short.
And we talked about the river fire
A
burn
lot.
scar a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think that
We
needs
don't
to be
need to
talked
do the
about again.
video
I'd skip
itself.
over it.
The video.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, then here, jumping back in. So the goal of our watershed program is to create resilient forests and headwater areas. We want to do this in order to secure our water supply into the future and also for human health and safety and for biological resources, for tribal cultural resources. It means that we are constantly utilizing adaptive management, which means we go out, we assess whether it's understanding historically what happened in the watershed or the on-site conditions right now. We go out, we install forest plots. We're hugging trees, measuring trees, identifying species, looking for disease. That's part of our whole process. Our objectives here are lined out. I think Cameron already ran through a lot of them as we did kind of the top-down watershed tour, which is improved hydrologic function, improved snowpack accumulation, wildfire risk reduction, resilient forests, hazard tree removal, carbon sequestration, increased resilience and to pests and disease within our forests, and improved wildlife habitat. Okay, big click. We're facing this warming climate. We talk about this a lot also. In California, I think we're starting to wrap our heads around the fact that we're in a very climate challenged state. If you think about California, from desert to temperate rainforest, with mountains, with coastal, with desert on the rain shadow side, the diversity of the ecosystems, the numbers of people, the infrastructure, we got a lot we're dealing with. You think of a place like Maine, a little package. So California is a challenge, to say the least. The numbers of people that live here, and now we have these numbers of dead trees. I already referenced the Southern Sierra and the forest die-off we're seeing there. We're seeing it here. We're all familiar with these pockets of dead trees. Everyone is watching to see what happens in the Southern Sierra, because in some ways it's a forecast of what will be coming here. You're seeing species move north, and you're seeing species move up in elevation. That's how they talk about it a lot in terms of ecosystem change right now. We also,
Quick question. So you have a figure of 60% of the water supply for Sierra Nevada. Do you have a figure for carbon sequestration? How much are we give the lungs of California?
I don't know. I would like to know that. So how much is the headwaters in general part of?
Well, I mean, all Sierra Nevada is 60% of the water.
Sierra.
How much are we the lungs? And then also irrigated pasture, because carbon sequestration really takes place on irrigated pasture.
Yep, irrigated pasture, meadows. There's been really interesting work done on both to look at how much carbon is captured and locked up.
Yeah.
We're also seeing significant reductions in snow melt, so that changes how and when the water is available to the vegetation. I think we're all hearing that we're seeing these elevated temperature events during summer season where you've got this desiccation of the vegetation during a longer period, and that's also certainly influencing our fire behavior. So watershed stewardship here at NID, we use forest management as one of our primary tools. We do meadow restoration, we do grazing. Watershed education and outreach is a key part of our program. We want to build watershed literacy in our communities. So of course we start with students, but also we do community tours, and we've brought the community onto restoration projects and forestry projects. Sometimes we expand our work to do green waste days. Now there's a lot more happening at the county level, but 3 and 4 years ago there wasn't yet. So we had days where we just had staff and chippers there in Cascade Shores when we did some of our Scott's Flat work, and the community could drive in with truckloads of branches and stuff, and just to build that understanding of working to reduce fuel loading. And we're always working and planning in coordination with other partners locally and regionally. We talk a lot about forest management. Unfortunately, the middle photo is a little bit dark, but the middle photo is the same photo as the bottom right. What we're doing is we're going in and we're strategically removing this overstocked or very dense understory community. We use mechanical thinning often, which is hand crews with chippers and masticators. The objective is to reduce the potential for wildfire to spread, so whether it's a ground fire that goes up into the canopy or to move out of an area if there's an ignition and it's moving out of, say, a campground or toward a campground, so there's a human health and safety objective, as well as working along roads that are used for ingress and egress on district property. We use those guys. So now, if we stare at this one for a few minutes, so you see, So what we want to do, I know it didn't come across in the packet, huh? You're like, what am I looking at? So when people often ask, like, how do you know where to work? And how do you know when to go back and work it again? So we've worked with a forester that we've contracted with for 6 or 8 years, Kevin Whitlock, and we have learned to go out and you put in a 1 acre forest plot where you're measuring and counting trees. You plug that in. This is a forest vegetation simulator model that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service. And basically, this is a burn simulator. And what you're looking at on the, I don't even know what side, the left side that just burned down all the way, that's an unmanaged forest, and that was at Peninsula Campground, and we had 2,700 trees per acre. We went in, and Cameron, when he showed you that slide, and it was the weird colors of kind of brown and kind of mustard at Rollins Reservoir, we've gone in and used CAL FIRE grant funding, and the district has matched it to do mechanical thinning to take it from 2,700 trees per acre, bring it down to say 130 or 40 trees per acre. So then when you put the same fire or you run the same burn model on it, you see the left hand burned all the way down to the ground, and the right hand, your fire pretty much stays on the ground. It's a much more controllable, containable event. This is the model that we run and go out to those same plots, take the same measurements to know when do we need to go back in to retreat it so we don't get the left-hand side.
We want to get a view of that. Lisa and I visited together years ago, Rollins campground, and she was asking me, what do we do here about these trees? Right? This is before, and now today it's the most beautiful thing. You can drive alongside the road and you can see it with the Rollins dam. It looks just like the picture.
We did a lot of thinning in there, and then we have these old fruit trees.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was like, so what do we do with these ones? But they're...
Probably said calm down.
You said they were...
Competition?
Yeah.
Competition? So you don't want to run this one?
No,
Okay.
time to run.
We have seen, but what we're seeing in this part of the Bear River Canyon is this was essentially a very steep, very difficult area that hadn't been managed, the majority of those 3,000 acres. And I'm not running it.
I'm letting it run.
Okay, and so it wasn't managed, so you see a complete burn, and I can't, Chris is driving, there we go.
Driving fast.
And I'm back, I know.
We will make it.
Yeah.
Okay. Forest management always includes hazard tree removal. We're always looking at what we call targets. Targets are things that a tree would fall on and smash and damage, whether it's, of course, human health and safety focused, first and foremost, and then district infrastructure. Any pieces of our water system, our campgrounds, our roads, and so we go out every year and we work with the forester to assess our campgrounds and to go in and remove and cut down the hazard trees. We're doing that right now, all over the place with Monica. Selective thinning. In the past, Cameron referenced the Cross Canyon Fuel Break, which is essentially the Scott Flat Dam, that section of the Deer Creek Canyon. When there was a market for selling timber, we went out and we had a timber harvest plan. We went out and had the forester carefully mark trees, because if we're gonna go and thin, and this is actually a logging operation, you see that truck filled with logs hauling out, we're always looking toward our final forest community conditions. What do we want it to be? And we want this multi-species, multi-aged community, but you want space. You really need space between your trees to reduce competition and to reduce wildfire risk. So this was a logging operation at near Scotts Flat Reservoir. That's one of the tools we use. We do meadow assessment. Healthy functioning meadows, the Sierra Meadows Partnership is constantly trying to spread the good news and the word about the value of meadows from a biological perspective, from a hydrologic perspective, from a carbon sequestration perspective. Like, there's nothing that they do that's bad. Meadows are incredible, rich, important parts of the Sierra. So we're assessing our meadows and we're building in strategies to support their improved function and to reduce the wildfire risk at them, because we're seeing meadows burning in some of these large wildfires.
And do we have other meadows besides English meadows that we'll go to next?
Yes, we want to get out and assess Austin Meadow and Middle and Shotgun. English was calling out for help. These photos here, English Meadow, kind of late summer season. One of us is harvesting grass heads. I'm gonna say it's Cameron, because he can't deny it, because I can't see. But you're seeing here, the close-up picture of the rocks is actually this really clear, cold water that's flowing out of the meadow, gathers in the middle Yuba and flows on downstream, provides this high-quality aquatic habitat, enters the watershed. We want to look at Austin Meadows as well as Middle and Shotgun. Middle and Shotgun have real challenges to access. So we haven't figured that out, but that'll be next. We want to increase the resilience of these systems, because this is English Meadow in the mid-1800s. This is one, I think this is the first dam, Rudyard Dam.
And this one was the one that got blown up?
The second one.
Was the second one.
So this one failed, I believe.
Yeah, they worked so hard to build that beautiful structure.
And it
The meadow was not happy about it.
Well, so they inundated the meadow, it failed, it rapidly drains. They go back, they rebuild it, and this was for hydraulic mining. They rebuild it, they inundate the meadow. The story has it, farmers came up from Yuba City area, blasted it. It rapidly drained again, and it was never rebuilt. And the
These are richest people. Richest family.
Ancestor.
And so that said, though, this has had this rapid filling and draining, really changed the soils, really changed how the Middle Yuba River flows through the system now. So what we've done is designed a project that will address the channel structures to add more complexity to the system, with the big overarching goal to be keep the water in the meadow for longer. During these spring runoff events, the river raises rapidly, it blasts through, it scours, it picks up sediment and bed load, it brings it downstream through the canyon, drops it into Jackson Meadows Reservoir. We don't want any of that. We want the river to flood out and utilize its floodplain. You want it to saturate those soils. You want it to recharge the shallow groundwater. We've got a system of groundwater monitoring wells. So if you think of a meadow, essentially like that, there's a whole groundwater basin beneath it. We worked with researchers at Sacramento State. So we've got a system of monitoring wells, so we'll know change in groundwater. We've got a stream gauge. Hopefully, we're going to shift the hydrograph from that, stretch it out so it holds it. You don't have the high peak. You stretch it out so it holds water longer, and that feeds into the Middle Yuba River later in the season. Meadows have that absorbent capacity to operate that way.
Do you have beavers in the neighborhood?
We saw little sticks that have been chewed, and we've seen on-site some. My understanding is the habitat isn't there yet. They need deeper pools to really take up residence, but we're encouraging and inviting them to come. Tea.
Yeah.
I've asked Cal Fish and Wildlife, and I was told, no, I may not bring beavers out there. Yeah, it's.
Trap and haul.
Yeah, no, you can't do that.
Helicopter and drop.
There's, ditches were excavated on the north side of the meadow historically to dry it out. So can we zoom this for anyone to see?
Yeah, we need that.
It's so hard to see this, I don't know.
And this will all be available, including the
Yeah.
videos, on the website.
So what you see here, the water flows into the the middle.
No.
Yuba River flows from bottom right hand of this image, flows out to the left. The meadow, this is roughly a 300-acre project where we will be working in the valley bottom. Oh, look, Chris, you did it. Oh, thank you. Beautiful. And so this really hard to look at picture, for instance, right there, perfect, Chris. You see the little orange numbers going down the main blue line. The main blue line is the main stem channel. Those are going to breed debris jams and riffles, where we take trees and we use on-site boulder and cobbles from the river to build these structures that are essentially perpendicular to flow, so the water's going to spread out, spread out, spread out. And we're going to put a lot of them in, like 60-something. And then you see the oxbow on that north side. That's cutting back up into the meadow. We're going to treat eroding 2 sites for erosion where we lay it back. There's dewatering, that straight brown line that's above that kind of yellowish. Perfect. Thank you, Chris. That's a dewatering channel that was cut in the last 60 years or so. We're going to fill that in. Again, we want to keep the water in the meadow. We're going to do fuels treatment outside of the pink line here to thin the forest, as well as to treat, which means remove, the dense understory and the lodgepole pine that are encroaching into the meadow. Okay, I'm gonna go quick here. This is what the team looks like some days. You've got everyone here from a project team where we went out to survey in something and measure stuff to Ashley is standing on our stream gauge there in the top right corner. Okay, that was English Meadow project. English Meadow happens to be part of an upper division grazing allotment. Right now, we're not allowing grazing because we're in the middle of the restoration work and we've been doing significant on-site surveys. But we will, after the project stabilizes and done, engage with Forest Service. They have a range manager. They're monitoring their impacts on Forest Service land. We'll talk about, is this appropriate and when and where within the meadow. Lower division grazing is the bottom photo, so we do graze on some of the district parcels to manage grass. Watershed education and outreach. We often are going out to talk with schools and to invite students and community members to district properties to discuss everything from kind of Watershed 101 to an on-site consideration. We've got, we've participated, a number of us, even in this room, I see some smiling, friendly faces, have gone to the Nevada County STEAM Expo, where we're judges when they hold it. COVID has, I think, made for the last 3 years, they haven't done the STEAM Expo, but that's the science,
Technology.
engineering, arts, and math expo, where we do a whole county-wide poster session, and we go just to help support all things educational in the community, and that's always been great. We have had Civic Spark AmeriCorps interns come in the past, which has been great, and one is still sitting here. And so we have signed up and invited 2 more.
Former Civic Spark.
So we had 2 in the past, a former sparkler, we call them sometimes. We'll have 2 more hopefully coming this year, which means recent college graduates that want to come and dig in, get on the ground and start learning about water resource management and planning and projects. And then we partner and like to work with lots of folks. Regional collaboration, whether that is kind of the broadest scale like CABI, the Cosumnes, American Bear and Yuba watersheds. We're part of a regional effort that has met, and we do work at times, and sometimes that kind of quiets and then it rises again, usually depending on funding, to working across jurisdictional boundaries. We already talked about the Forest Service Master Stewardship Agreement, or if there's a Headwaters program, because we realize you need to be working and thinking at a watershed scale to take care of your water resources. Okay, this year we are wrapping up, in broad strokes, we're wrapping up past grants at Scotts Flat Reservoir. We've just completed 300 acres of treatment. The idea being that while we may only own 9% of the lands that comprise the watershed areas that we are concerned with, we tend to own this little ribbon around a storage reservoir. Well, by protecting that area, you're creating a buffer, so when a wildfire pushes through, you can hopefully then not have such a significant impact on a storage reservoir specifically. So we go out and we've worked to not only address human health and safety and water system objectives, but also to create a buffer around Scotts Flat Reservoir. We're doing that where we can as well at Rollins Reservoir. Those are our highest risk mid-elevation storage reservoirs within the wildland-urban interface. We've prioritized those 2 areas. We've partnered with CAL FIRE and the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and also the English Meadow Project is creating a new partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Board. So we're really looking at many different funding opportunities. I think we can say that we, from the state to the national level, we understand the importance of watersheds, and dollars are really starting to arrive that way to achieve those goals. And then we continue to do all the programmatic pieces that we always have, from doing hazard tree assessments to doing our administration of grants and ongoing planning activities, continuing to monitor the condition of district parcels within the river fire. This picture here is Cameron out, I think last fall before the first atmospheric river arrived, where we're looking at soils. We've gone out with USGS within the burn scar to look at district lands and done this thing where you pick up burned soils and you're pinching and you're looking for root hairs to look at the severity of the burn on your forest soils and whether or not they would become hydrophobic, which means they would expel water rather than absorb it. So there's all sorts of burn-related.
All right, before we move, wait, hold on. Wait, we're not done yet. Okay, not quite done yet. So before we move off, I do want to circle back up with a couple of comments from the public, as always promised. So Joy Waite, she did have a question regarding NID-owned properties, and it appeared to her that one of the maps gave the impression that NID owns all the lands associated with the proposed Centennial Reservoir footprint. I think maybe we're looking at the wrong map, so Joy, please look at the NID System Infrastructure and Area of Interest map that shows the actual properties owned by NID. Are they all on here? Yeah.
Those are all the properties.
Yeah, those are all in there. They're in blue. Miriam from Sierra Harvest states, on behalf of the Nevada County Food Policy Council, we appreciate immensely your excellent efforts to care for the health of the watersheds and supply our local farms and ranchers with water so that they may provide food for our community. Therefore, your environmental stewardship efforts help strengthen our local food system so that we may be more food secure during challenging times such as the pandemic. Very good comment. Thank you, Miriam. That is a good comment, all good comments. We have one comment from Carol. She states, I read that the recent green waste disposal results were sent to a biomass plant in Lincoln. Are there some local synergies possible here? So the district did just recently enter into a contract with the local biomass plant facility that is located in Lincoln to be one of the options for some of our forestry work. I am not aware of any local biomass plants, are you?
That's the closest one that we've got down in Rio Bravo, or Lincoln, yeah.
Yeah, so that one's Rio Bravo, that's the closest one. I do keep hearing that Placer County is working on a facility, but I'm not sure what the status of that currently is. Otis Wallen, I want to extend appreciation to NID for the strides it has made towards genuine, healthy watershed management in the last 10 years of its 100-year history, particularly with the constraints of owning less than 10% of the land that allow some freedom to proceed in this way. My question is a repetition of the question I've previously asked. If this is a 50-year plan, NID can very logically assume it will be receiving in partnership with PCWA the divestment by PG&E of the South Fork, Yuba, and Bear watersheds of the Drum Spalding system. If you are looking out 50 years, will you be embracing this reality? With regard to the contract you are about to approve tomorrow, how easily can you change that model to expand it to the more likely source water storage facilities, etc.? How prepared is NID to expand its newly emerging watershed stewardship business to expand to this impending reality? What is NID's projection for the Drum Spalding divestment by PG&E? You have heard my guess. As soon as PG&E gets the FERC license, I divest the liability of the Bear Canal system to the JPA. Thanks for this presentation. I think at this time, although Otis has some very interesting points, I don't know that we're completely prepared to plan the next 50 years based off of PG&E divesting, but I can be assured, and I'm sure David and Doug can also weigh in on this, that the modeling, specifically the hydrology effort, will include the areas surrounding most of the Drum Spalding system. So I think that our effort will make us well suited to leverage any opportunities in the future. We are also, we always continue these conversations with PG&E as well as PCWA regarding that system. Right now, I would be amiss from a professional standpoint to base our future water supply off of acquiring PG&E system, but I do think it's something that we need to ensure that all of our tools can handle and plan for. So I think with that, is there any more public questions? No hands. All right. Board members?
I just, several months ago, we had the district surplus properties discussion, and we received a list of all of the properties. And so it was super helpful today to see where they're located and the very strategic role that the ownership of those properties provides the district in ensuring that our source water supplies can be treated so readily. I mean, when we just got the list, I didn't really have a context. So this really put that discussion into context, which I appreciate, and also being able to do the work that you've been doing to make sure they're as fire safe as possible. So it was really interesting from that point of view too.
I think so as well. It's a lot of pieces of information that are all kind of coming together, which is nice to see. So we just do a little process check-in. So our next stage will be risk. We do anticipate having it here in this room, and then following that, like I stated earlier, we will be looking for an off-site facility to house our strategic planning efforts. Also, a couple of board meetings due to the construction of the bridge that comes across from the parking lot for access to the building. So stay tuned. We will make sure everybody is aware of our plans. Mr. Feldman states, excellent presentation. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Cameron, Nasa, thank you so much. You always do just such a wonderful job. Sorry we're a little squeezed on time. We are trying not to go to 2 meetings again. That's good. All righty. And I think that's all we had. I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Beerwagen.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Nasa and Cameron. exciting stuff. Really informative and very, very good. Yep. Thank you, David, for coming today.
Yeah, that was really good.
Awesome.
It's gonna get even better, so, yeah. It will.
Yes, all right. Any other more comments? Meeting's adjourned.